There is a plant growing at the edge of nearly every stream in Europe. It has been there for a very long time. Long enough that the people of the Bronze Age knew it by name and put it in their burial mounds and their drinking vessels. Long enough that a Danish physician wrote careful prescriptions for it in the 13th century. Long enough that a Queen of England chose it above everything else available to her to scent the rooms where she slept and worked and thought. Long enough that the chemists who invented aspirin, one of the most widely used medicines in human history, borrowed its name without most people ever noticing. It grows in wet meadows and along riverbanks, tall and dark-stemmed, crowned in summer with creamy white flowers that smell of almonds and honey and something just slightly medicinal underneath. You have almost certainly walked past it. You may have smelled it without knowing what you were smelling. Tonight, we are going to sit with it for a while, with its folklore and its chemistry, its Bronze Age burials and its Elizabethan chambers, its Norse mythology and its modern pharmacology, its place in the mead and the medicine chest and the apothecary's jar and the European regulatory dossier. With everything this one plant has been to the people who found it growing at the edge of the water and decided it was worth knowing better. My name is Master Aldworth. I have been an apothecary for more years than I care to count, and tonight, if you are willing, I would like to tell you about meadowsweet. If you find that this is the kind of company you would like to keep, long evenings, quiet voices, the history of plants that have been quietly useful to people for longer than most things we call ancient, then consider leaving a like on this video and subscribing so you find your way back. It costs you nothing, and it helps this little corner of the world remain lit. And while you are settling in, I am curious. Where in the world are you listening from tonight? Leave it in the comments if you are still awake enough to do so. We have listeners from places that would have surprised even me, and I find I enjoy knowing where the voice reaches. Now, let us begin with the plant itself. There is a plant I want to show you. Not in a jar, this time not dried and labeled on a shelf. Not pressed between the pages of an old herbal, not powdered and measured into a paper twist. Tonight, the plant is still growing, still standing in the place it has always preferred, at the edge of moving water, in the wet grass of an unmown meadow, somewhere between the stream and the field where the ground is soft underfoot and the air carries something you cannot quite name. You will know it when you see it. It stands tall, taller than you might expect from a hedgerow herb, sometimes reaching the height of a man's chest, sometimes higher, a full 2 meters in a good wet summer where the soil runs deep and the stream runs close. The stems are a dark reddish purple, like dried wine staining wood, straight-backed and unhurried, in the way of plants that have found exactly the place they belong and see no reason to apologize for it. The leaves are elm-like, broad-toothed, deeply veined, darkly green above, and pale and soft beneath, carrying a faint whitish down on their undersides that you only notice if you turn one over and look properly. They hold their shape well into the autumn, long after the flowering is done, still marking the wet ground for anyone who knows how to read a landscape in the grey months when most things have given up and retreated. The stems are worth a moment on their own. That dark reddish purple runs all the way up from the base, interrupted at intervals by the leaves, giving the whole plant a slightly formal quality. Something that presents itself with intention. In a wet meadow full of ordinary green, the dark-stemmed meadowsweet stands out the way a person stands out when they have dressed for an occasion and everyone else has not. You notice it? You cannot quite help noticing it. And the flowers? The flowers are the reason this plant was carried from Ireland to Siberia in the botanical memory of every people who encountered it. They are creamy white, or the faintest shade of ivory, clustered into dense, frothy plumes at the tops of those dark stems, hundreds of tiny blossoms gathered together into something that looks, from a little distance, like a low summer cloud caught among the grasses. Not one cloud, but many, at different heights along different stems, swaying when there is any movement in the air, catching the light differently at different times of day. In the morning, with dew still on them, they hold a faint greenish cast. At midday, they are pure white, almost luminous against the sky. In the evening light, they warm toward cream. They appear in June and linger into August, marking the long light of the northern summer. And from the moment they open, they release a scent that no description quite captures, honestly. Sweet, yes, deeply, almost unreasonably sweet, but also green and faintly medicinal beneath the sweetness. Something almond-like, something that catches at the back of the throat in a way that is not unpleasant, but is unmistakably botanical. There is a sharpness underneath the honey note, a brightness that keeps the sweetness from becoming cloying, that reminds you this is a wild thing and not a confection. It smells like something that does something, like something with purpose, beneath the pleasure. Bees visit the flowers constantly through the summer months, though not for nectar. There is no nectar here. The plant makes none. What it offers instead is pollen, and the insects that work its blossoms are there for that alone, which gives meadowsweet a particular and interesting economy. Nothing freely given except what must be earned by actually doing the work of the flower. The bees arrive regardless. The transaction is completed. The flowers are visited and the pollen is moved and the plant sets seed and the meadow continues. The whole arrangement proceeding with the calm indifference of something that has been working this way for a very long time. When the flowers are spent, something equally precise takes their place. The fruits form in small, tight spirals, round composite structures with a distinctive, furrowed twist like a miniature rope, coiled in on itself, like something made deliberately at a very small scale. These help anyone who knows them to identify the plant, even in late summer, when the white plumes are gone and the stems have begun to dry, and the meadow has taken on the tired post-flowering quality of August's end. The fruits are modest and unheroic, but they are precise. Useful things often are. Now, where does this plant live? The honest answer is almost everywhere in temperate Europe, and then some distance beyond. It grows in Ireland, where the summers are wet enough to suit it without any effort at all, where it colonizes riverbanks and the edges of fields too soft for cattle to graze comfortably. It grows in Norway, where it keeps company with birch and cold rivers running off high ground. It grows across Britain, in Wales along every stream valley, in Scotland along the burns, in England in the damp corners of fields and the sides of lanes that run near water. It grows across France, across the German plains, through the Slavic heartlands, and into the Balkans. It grows in Ukraine, in Moldova, along the Baltic coast, in the hills of Anatolia and the Caucasus, across the southern Russian steppe, and eastward still through Central Asia, into western Siberia, into Mongolia, and as far as Xinjiang in northwestern China. That is not the range of a humble plant. That is the range of something that has had a very long time to make itself at home, something that found the conditions it needed, damp, temperate, open, and followed them wherever they occurred, from the Atlantic coast to the edge of the Central Asian steppe, establishing itself in the wet margins and stream edges of one of the largest landmasses on Earth. It is frost hardy, not merely tolerant of cold winters, but genuinely adapted to them, surviving conditions in Norway, and the Baltic that would destroy less robust plants without any particular distress. A Nordic gene bank record classifies it as native across virtually all of Europe and into Western Asia, in habitats as different as Irish bog, margins and Balkan river banks and the Caucasian foothills. It does not appear in these places because it was planted or encouraged. It appears because the conditions of damp, temperate ground are what it prefers, and those conditions are widespread, and the plant, once established, knows exactly what to do with them. What it prefers most is wet, not swamp, not standing water, but the margins of streams, the edges of ditches, wet meadows that lie too low to drain properly and so remain damp through even a dry summer. unmown riverbanks where the vegetation is left to do what it chooses. In these places, meadowsweet does not merely survive. It colonizes. It forms dense stands, tall and vigorous, shading out smaller herbs beneath it, establishing itself as the dominant voice in the wet ground chorus. There is something emphatic about the way this plant grows. It does not ask permission. It does not fill gaps cautiously. It takes the ground it can take and holds it. The Scandinavian record shows it was gathered in bloom from June to early September. The whole plant harvested, valued for its fragrance and its taste in equal measure. The flowering window is the heart of the summer, the longest days, the warmest light. Midsummer, the season when the old calendar was most alive with observance and ritual and the marking of the turning year. This is not a coincidence. Plants that bloom at midsummer, that fill the warm air with scent precisely when the days are longest and the world is most awake, have always attracted human attention. They are impossible to overlook. They arrive at the moment when people are outdoors, when the hedgerows and meadows are being walked and worked and observed, when the eye is drawn to anything that stands above the green. Meadowsweet stands above the green. Its height puts it at face level for an adult moving through the meadow, which means the scent reaches you before the eye has found the plant. You smell it first. The sweetness arrives, and then you look, and there it is, taller than the grass, taller than most of what grows around it in that habitat. The dark stems and cream plumes marking their territory with the quiet confidence of something that has been doing this for a very long time. In still summer air, near water, the scent carries some distance. Sweet and green and faintly complex. Something between a meadow and a pharmacy, though that word would not have existed in the minds of the people who first noticed it. What they would have noticed is simpler, that the smell was pleasant, that the plant was tall and striking, that it grew in particular places, at particular times, with a reliability that could be counted on year after year. Reliable things acquire names. Reliable things acquire users. And this plant, which stands at the edge of rivers from Cork to Mongolia, which blooms every June without fail, which smells of summer in a way that is simultaneously comforting and medicinal and somehow ancient. This plant acquired, over a very long span of human time, an extraordinary number of both. We will get to all of them. But for now, while the summer is still here and the plant is still standing in the wet grass with its dark stems and its pale plumes and its particular unmistakable scent, I want you simply to see it. Stand with me for a moment at the edge of the water. Look at what we have here. Every name this plant has carried tells a different part of its story. And the plant has carried a great many names. This is in itself a kind of testimony. Plants that have been known across many cultures and many centuries accumulate names, the way old houses accumulate rooms, each edition reflecting the needs and the perceptions of a particular time, a particular place, a particular way of understanding what the plant was for. To go through the names carefully is to move through the history of the plant's relationship with the people who used it. Each name is a compressed archive. We begin with the Latin, because that is where formal botany begins, and because the Latin names of this plant are more revealing than most. The genus name is Synphilipendula, from findiphyllum meaning thread, and synpendulus, syne meaning hanging. This refers to the root tubers, small. Dense, rounded bodies suspended from slender thread, like roots that dangle in the wet soil when you lift the plant from the ground. Hold the roots up to the light and you see exactly what the name describes. Small things hanging from threads like beads on a string, like lanterns suspended from something too fine to see clearly. It is the name of a botanist who looked at the underside of a plant, at the part that most people never see, and found there the detail worth preserving in formal nomenclature. Not the flowers, not the scent, not the medicinal history or the ceremonial significance or the thousands of years of mead making. The root tubers hanging from their threads in the dark, wet soil. Precise, observational, unglamorous in the way that genuinely good descriptions often are. The species name is Cyelomeria, elm-like. A reference to those broad-toothed deeply veined leaflets that bear a genuine resemblance to elm foliage. Enough that the comparison was made independently, repeatedly, across centuries and cultures before anyone sat down to formalize it in Latin. Elm trees were common across Europe. Their leaves were familiar to anyone who walked in the landscape. When a meadow plant produced leaflets with that same toothed outline and that same deep venation, the comparison was natural and immediate. Ulmaria carrying the memory of a different tree in its name. The plant was not always called Filipendula ulmaria. Linnaeus, working in 1753, placed it in the genus Sabrisavia ulmaria. Was its name for over a century. Sabrisavia comes from the Greek subspera, meaning wreath, alluding to the showy wreath like clusters of white blossoms that characterize the group. You can see why the name was chosen, those dense cream. Colored plumes do look like something you might weave into a garland, carry in procession, wind into the hair of someone standing at the edge of a summer field. The wreath name was poetic, and it was accurate, and it stuck for a long time. I want you to hold that name, Spirea, because it will return later in this story in a context that makes it one of the more consequential plant names in the history of medicine. Not yet, but hold it. It was the botanist C.J. Maximovics who moved the species into Filipendula in the 19th century, separating the Filipendulas from the Spireas proper on structural grounds that made better sense of their relationships within the rose family. Taxonomy is full of such revisions, names given, then reconsidered, then revised again as understanding deepens. What remains constant through every revision is the plant itself, flowering every June regardless of what any human chooses to call it. There is also a subspecies, Subifilipendula ulmaria subsp. Pigbari, the steppe filipendula, distinguished by a 5-lobed terminal leaf segment and found in the drier ground from southern Russia into Iran. A reminder that even within the species, variation continues. The plant that colonizes Irish riverbanks and the plant that has adapted to the edges of the Russian steppe are related but not identical. Life, given enough time and space, always finds a way to diverge toward what is possible. Now, the common names, these are older than any Latin. These were in use before anyone wrote anything down, before the idea of a genus or a species existed as a formal category. These names are the record of encounter of communities meeting this plant in their landscapes, deciding it mattered, and naming it in the terms that made sense of what it was to them. The English name meadowsweet almost certainly comes from the Old English Toimiodu, sweet Thymead sweet. Not sweet as in honey, though honey is a central part of this story. Sweet as in the herb that sweetened mead, that flavored the great ceremonial drink of the Anglo-Saxon world, that was added to the fermentation and carried its scent into the drink and out the other side. The name does not describe what the plant looks like. It does not describe its height or its season or its color. It describes what the plant freedoes, what it has always been for. The name encodes a use, and through that use encodes a whole world of social practice. The mead hall, the feast, the shared cup, the ceremony of hospitality extended and received. In German, the plant is Primbein Desaises. The etymology here is doubled and genuinely contested, and the contest is more illuminating than a single explanation would be. It may come from Primmitrin, the German word for mead, connecting it to the same deep brewing tradition as the English name. Or it may come from Feimadide, meaning the act of mowing, because the plant grows in meadows, and its scent, when the hay is cut and the stems are broken, perfumes the newly mown field in a way that was distinctive enough to name. The smell of summer labor sweetened by this particular plant. Both etymologies are plausible. Both may be simultaneously true. This is how folk etymology often works. Not one explanation, but a convergence of reasons, each reflecting a different way of knowing the same plant. The mead maker and the haymaker arrived at the same name by different routes, which means the plant was present in both parts of their lives. In Danish, it is Sialmindelig joydart, a common mead herb. The word free, almindelig, common, ordinary, is doing something important here. This is not the exotic or the rare. This is the plant everyone knows, the one you do not need to explain to a Dane because it is simply there in the wet places, by the streams, every summer without fail. The name says, yes, this one, the mead herb. The common one, ours. Familiarity extended across a whole culture and preserved in a name. Behind all of these names, the Latin thread hangers and the Greek wreaths and the Anglo-Saxon mead sweeteners and the German hay cutters and the Danish common mead herbs is the same plant, standing at the stream's edge, flowering in June, carrying its particular and unmistakable scent across whatever century happens to be passing, entirely indifferent to the question of what it is being called this time, simply doing what it has always done. Let us go back, much further back. Before the Latin names, before the apothecaries and their herbal manuscripts, before the learned physicians writing in candlelit studies with their jars of dried herbs and their careful ink, before the Anglo-Saxon mead halls and the Norse feasting tables and the great carved drinking horns passed from hand to hand across the fire, before recorded history in any form that we can read, or any writing in any language, or any institution we would recognize as medicine or botany in its formal sense. Let us go back to the Bronze Age, to the graves of people whose names we do not know, and whose language we cannot speak, and whose world we can only approach through what they chose to leave in the ground, to the cairns of Wales and the burial mounds of Orkney, and the ancient interments of Scotland and Ireland, where archaeologists have spent patient decades brushing soil from bone and pottery, and the desiccated remnants of things placed deliberately alongside the dead, and among those remnants, again and again. In sites separated by hundreds of miles and hundreds of years, meadows, wheat. Not as an accident, not as a weed that happened to grow near the grave and was sealed in by the closing of the earth. The presence is too consistent for accident, too repeated across too many sites, too many traditions, too many communities with no direct connection to each other, except the shared landscape and the shared plant. Meadowsweet was placed deliberately with the dead. It was brought to the grave. It was chosen for the occasion in the same way that other things were chosen. The pottery, the tools, the grave goods that archaeologists catalogue with such care, because they tell us what the living considered important enough to send with someone who was leaving. That is not a trivial category. What you choose to place in a grave tells us what you believe matters, what you think the dead will need, what you understand the passage to require. And across Bronze Age Britain and Ireland, across communities separated by geography and time, one of the answers to those questions was this plant, the cream-flowered, almond-scented herb of the wet meadows and the stream edges, the one that blooms at midsummer and smells of summer itself. But the evidence goes further than plant remains, further and more specific and more extraordinary. Chemical analysis of grave vessels, pottery and other containers found in burial sites in Orkney, in Scotland and in Wales, has detected residues of honey-based mead flavored with meadowsweet. Not pressed flowers laid alongside the body, not botanical material scattered on the earth, the drink made with the plant. The mead that had been prepared, honey fermented with water, the flowers of meadowsweet steeped into the fermentation or added afterward, the scent and the chemistry of those cream blossoms absorbed into the drink and preserved there through whatever process of drying or concentration left residues, detectable 3,000 years later. The dead were given something to drink. Sit with that for a moment. These were not people who left grave goods carelessly or arbitrarily. The vessels placed in a Bronze Age burial were chosen. The drink placed in those vessels was chosen, and the drink was mead, and the mead smelled of meadowsweet, the same ceremonial drink that the living shared at their most significant gatherings, at feasts, at the sealing of alliances, at the celebration of harvests, at the welcoming of guests into the hall, was prepared and placed with the dead as something they would need, or something appropriate to their new condition, or something that marked the seriousness and the sacredness of the passage they were making. The scent of meadowsweet was the last thing those people sent with the dead. That sweet, green, almond, honey fragrance rising from the vessel in the grave as it was sealed away. A smell of summer, a smell of ceremony, a smell that, for the people placing it there, carried everything the culture associated with the plant, the feast, the gathering, the marking of the significant moment. In one particular Welsh Bronze Age cairn, meadowsweet was found alongside both human and animal remains. A multi-species deposit, a bringing together of different kinds of life in a single ceremonial space. The plant and the person and the animal placed together under the stones. This is not a simple floral tribute. This is something more complex, a ritual logic that understood the significant moment as requiring the presence of more than one kind of being. The plant was not decoration, it was participant. A Danish ethnobotanical source underlines what the chemistry confirms. Finds of meadowsweet in Bronze Age graves can indicate the presence of honey-based mead or flavored ale. In the Nordic understanding, meadowsweet was the characteristic mead, herb not incidental to the drink but central to its identity. The mead was meadowsweet mead. The scent was inseparable from the occasion. By the Bronze Age, the association between this plant and this drink was already old enough to be unremarked already, so thoroughly embedded in practice that it needed no explanation, no ceremony around the ceremony. You made mead, the meadowsweet went in. These were not two decisions, but one. And then there is the continuity. The Danish ethnobotanical work notes something that should stop us in our tracks. Meadowsweet appears in Bronze Age graves, and it appears later in monastic herb gardens in the Christian monasteries of medieval Scandinavia, cultivated by monks who were working within an entirely different religious and intellectual framework, who had no stated intention of preserving pre-Christian practices, who were simply growing the plants that were useful and that the tradition said were useful. The same plant, different centuries, different ceremonies, the same unbroken thread of human attention. This is the pattern of plants that genuinely work. They do not disappear when the religion changes. They do not vanish when one culture replaces another, when one framework of meaning gives way to a different one. They persist because the properties that made them useful in the Bronze Age burial are the same properties that make them useful in the medieval monastery. The scent, the medicine, the particular quality of presence that caused people to reach for them at significant moments across 3,000 years of changing everything else. The people who placed meadowsweet in those Bronze Age graves are as far from the medieval monks as the medieval monks are from us, and yet the plant connects them, moving forward through time in the hands of people who did not need to understand why it had always been there, in order to understand that it should continue to be. The Druids considered it one of their most valued herbs. The sources on this require some honest handling. The Druids left no written record of their own practices. Everything we know of their tradition arrives through intermediaries, Roman accounts composed by men who were at best curious observers and at worst active enemies of the culture they describe. Irish and Welsh manuscript traditions that preserved pre-Christian knowledge in the only form available for preservation, which was writing, which imposed its own changes and framings on what was being recorded. Later interpretations built on those already interpreted sources. The Druidic record is fragmentary, mediated, contested at almost every point. And yet the consistency across multiple independent strands of Celtic tradition is notable enough to carry weight. Meadowsweet appears not as one herb among many, but as something categorically set apart, one of the three most sacred plants of the Druidic world, alongside water mint and vervain. Three plants, the number carrying its own significance in Celtic tradition, associated with ritual, with healing, with protection, with the ceremonies at the turning points of the year, when the boundary between the ordinary world and whatever lay beyond it was understood to be thinner than usual. Water, mint, vervain, meadowsweet. Consider where each of these grows. Watermint is a plant of streams and wet margins. Its roots in the water, its scent released by every footstep through a marshy place. Vervain prefers disturbed, liminal ground, roadsides, field edges, the places that are neither cultivated nor entirely wild, the threshold zones between the managed world and the unmanaged one. And meadowsweet stands precisely at the boundary between meadow and water, in the damp margin that belongs fully to neither, where the solid ground gives way gradually to something less certain underfoot. The three sacred herbs share a preference for edges, for the places that are not quite one thing or another. For the zones of transition, the margins, the thresholds where categories blur and the boundary between states becomes permeable. This is not coincidence. In a tradition that understood the world as structured around thresholds and passages and the careful navigation of boundaries, the sacred herbs were precisely those that grew at the boundaries, that inhabited the margins, that could be gathered at the edge of things, where the ordinary world met something else. What that sacred status meant in practice we can reason about, even where we cannot document it precisely. A plant considered sacred by a tradition that paid close, sustained attention to the natural world would have been gathered with ceremony. At particular times, in particular ways, perhaps with particular words spoken over the gathering, it would have been used in specific contexts that ordinary herbs did not enter. It would have been known with a depth of knowledge that went beyond the practical, not just what it did medicinally, but what it meant, what it represented, what its presence at a ceremony contributed beyond its physical properties. And we can say with more confidence that the sacred status recorded in later sources reflects something built slowly over generations, through long familiarity, through repeated experience of what this plant does to the air around it, and to the body, and to the mood of those who breathe it. The Druidic tradition did not assign sacred status arbitrarily. It paid attention, and it recorded what it found. Meadowsweet earned what it was given. Now, the mead, because the mead is inseparable from everything else. Mead was not merely a drink in the Celtic and Germanic Norse worlds. This is important enough to say plainly. Mead was the drink through which the social world was constituted and renewed. It was the medium of feasting and oath, taking and the extension of hospitality. It was carried in ceremonial vessels of gold and bronze. It was shared at the most significant gatherings, the sealing of alliances, the celebration of victories, the welcome of honored guests, the sending off of the honored dead. The host who offered mead was offering something more than a beverage. The guest who accepted it was entering into relationship. In the Norse tradition, specifically, mead carries mythological weight that goes beyond the social. The mead of poetry, brewed from the blood of the wise, being kvass, was the substance that gave the gift of eloquence and wisdom. The Valkyries served mead in Valhalla to the honored dead. Mead was the drink of gods and heroes, the substance of ceremony, the medium through which ordinary life touched something larger than itself. And meadowsweet was its flavoring, its aromatic signature, the scent that rose from the cup. This means that every time mead was poured, at every feast, every funeral, every ceremony, every oath, the smell of meadowsweet was present in the air, not as incidental background, as part of the occasion itself, as one of the things that made the occasion what it was, the scent that everyone in that hall had grown up associating with the most serious and the most celebratory moments of communal life, breathed in again, recognizable, carrying everything it had always carried. A scent that smelled of belonging, of the community gathered, of whatever was being marked. Is it any wonder the Druids counted it sacred? The Norse record presents a specific challenge that is worth acknowledging directly, explicit, named references to meadowsweet, in surviving Old Norse texts are scarce. One source states this plainly: the plant's Old Norse identity is harder to pin down than its Anglo-Saxon one. The sagas and the Eddas and the law codes and the skaldic poetry, the texts that survive from the Norse world, are not comprehensive records of botanical knowledge. The daily practice of which plants went into the mead, which herbs were gathered from the wetlands in summer, which things were known and used in the kitchens and the healing practices of Norse communities. This was largely unwritten. It was held in practice, passed in households and between neighbors, never committed to the manuscripts that the monasteries preserved. The absence of explicit written reference is not evidence of absence. The Nordic Gene Bank records meadowsweet as native across Norway, Sweden, Finland, Denmark, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, the entire geographic reach of Norse influence. The Danish name Seimdørdata, mead herb, preserves the same association as the English Thymiodou sweettide. The plant grew abundantly in Scandinavian wetlands, accessible to every rural community without effort or expense. And the mead was there, the feasting culture was there, the tradition of flavoring fermented drinks with aromatic herbs was there. The unremarked is not the unimportant. The things so thoroughly woven into daily life that no one thinks to record them. The things assumed, the things everyone knows, the things that need no explanation, because they are simply part of what is done. These are often the things most central to a culture's actual lived experience. Meadowsweet in Norse mead may have been too obvious to mention, in the same way that salt in Norse food was too obvious to mention. It was there, everyone knew it was there, no one wrote it down, because writing it down would have been like writing down that water is wet. What the Northern European brewing tradition also preserved. And what is worth noting is that the choice of meadowsweet for mead was not purely aesthetic, not merely for the scent, not merely for the flavor. Northern European recipes used meadowsweet in fermented drinks for its preservative qualities, possibly its antimicrobial properties, which we now know exist, and which would have been experienced as the empirical observation that mead made with meadowsweet kept better, resisted the souring and spoiling that threatened any fermented drink in the days before refrigeration or sterile technique. The pleasure and the practicality were entangled, as they always are with this plant. The scent was also a preservative, the flavoring was also a function. The thing that made the mead beautiful to drink also made it safer to drink and longer lasting in the vessel. This is meadowsweet's characteristic mode throughout its history. The thing it does for pleasure and the thing it does for medicine are never fully separate, never cleanly distinguishable, always running together in the same gesture, the same preparation, the same cup. In Celtic practice, the plant extended its usefulness beyond mead into vinegars and cordials and food preservation. It was part of the aromatic texture of everyday life in the wet, temperate, plant-rich landscapes of the Celtic world, from Ireland across to the Baltic, in places where summer meant meadowsweet, the way it meant long days and the sound of water and the particular quality of northern light on a field that has just been cut. A plant, so thoroughly present in the sensory world of a culture, becomes, over time, part of what that culture understands itself to be, part of what it means to be in this place, part of the smell of home, of the feast of the season turning, of the dead being properly sent on their way. Not separate from the culture, but woven into it at the level of scent and taste and the feel of a summer day. Meadowsweet was woven in, across the full reach of Northern European culture, in its Celtic and Germanic and Norse and Anglo-Saxon expressions, in its pre-Christian and Christian continuations, in its Bronze Age origins and its medieval persistence. The thread running through all of it is the same thread, like root, hanging its small tubers in the dark, wet soil, flowering every June regardless, carrying its scent across whatever world happened to be passing above it. Something interesting happened to meadowsweet in the modern era. It was remembered, not rediscovered. It had never been lost to the people who used it. The herbalists and the brewers and the rural communities of Scandinavia and the Baltic, who had simply continued quietly doing what their grandparents had done with it, but remembered in a different sense, claim, named, held up, and recognized as something specifically northern, specifically part of what it means to come from these landscapes and these traditions. Modern Nordic herbal producers began marketing meadowsweet explicitly as a Nordic ingredient, not merely a European plant, not merely a herb found in Nordic landscapes, but something carrying Nordic identity, embedded in the northern tradition of mead and medicine, and the long relationship between these communities and their wet, plant-rich ground. An Estonian Nordic producer situates it among Nordic ingredients, connecting it to the folk medicine of Northern Europe, while making it available in contemporary wellness products. The historical use becomes a living connection, rather than a historical footnote. This is not cynical. The plant genuinely is what is claimed for it. The history genuinely is there. What happened was less a rebranding than a re-seeing, a culture looking at something ordinary and familiar and finding on closer attention that it was extraordinary and ancient and deserved more recognition than the ordinary receives. And alongside the cultural reclaiming came the goddess associations, stated now with more specificity than the older fragmentary record allowed. Modern Norse mythology writing describes meadowsweet as sacred to goddesses of love and fertility, used in wedding rites and love rituals, known in some tellings as the Meadow Queen of Old Norse tradition. The soft white flower of the summer wetland associated with the feminine divine, with love, with beauty, with the fertility of the land and its creatures. And then there is the Valkyrie connection, which carries the plant's characteristic duality into the heart of Norse mythology. The Valkyries served mead in Valhalla. They moved between the battlefield, choosing the honored dead, and the great hall, where those dead were feasted and restored. Their role was simultaneously martial and hospitable, warriors and hosts, figures of death and of welcome, and the mead they poured carried the scent of meadowsweet, which means the cream-white flower of the summer meadow was present in Valhalla, in the cup offered to the honored dead, in the gesture of welcome extended across the boundary between the living world and whatever lay beyond it. The soft flower and the warrior, sweetness and death, the meadow and the hall of the fallen. Meadowsweet has always held both of these things. The plant strewn at weddings and placed in graves, the herb that makes the heart merry, and the herb that, in too great a quantity, brings the deep sleep, the Bronze Age mead poured for the living, and the Bronze Age mead poured for the dead. The Valkyrie connection does not create this duality, it simply names what was already there. Now we come to the part of the story that is hardest to classify. Not history, exactly. Not medicine, not botany. Something older than all of those categories, or perhaps running beneath them the way the water table runs beneath the meadow. Invisible most of the time, present always, feeding everything that grows above it. The mythology of the plant. The story is told about it not to explain what it did, but to say what it to us, see not its actions, but its nature. Not its uses, but its meaning. We begin in Wales, in the Mabinogion, that collection of Welsh mythological tales, written down in the Middle Ages. There is a woman made from flowers. The tales draw on an oral tradition far older. Stories told and retold across generations before anyone committed them to a page. The magicians, Gwydion and Math, are given a problem. A young man named Lord Jiffers has been cursed by his mother, cursed specifically never to have a wife of human birth. The curse is precise and meant to be insurmountable. No woman of flesh and blood and ordinary human making may be his companion. The two magicians consider this, and then they do something that the Mabinogion describes with a matter of factness that makes it more strange rather than less. They make a woman from flowers, 3 blossoms: oak flower, broom flower, meadowsweet flower. From these 3, Gwydion and Math conjure a woman. Her name is Blodawd, in Welsh, flower face. She is made to be a wife, to be beautiful, to be the perfect companion. And she is all of these things, and she is also other things. She has desires. She makes choices. She acts on those choices with consequences that reshape everything. She is not a passive creation. She is a full being with a full being's capacity for wanting what she wants. But that is her story, and I will not compress it into something smaller than it deserves. What matters for our purposes is the construction. The magicians looked at the world and chose 3 blossoms for the making of a woman. Not roses, though roses were known and valued. Not lilies, not the most obviously beautiful or symbolic flowers available to them. They chose oak, broom, and meadowsweet, 3 plants of the Welsh summer landscape. 3 things that flower in the warmth of the year. 3 things with presence and scent, and a particular kind of vitality. And among the 3, meadowsweet was one. Not a decoration, not a garnish. One of the 3 essential components of something human and female and alive. The magicians understood, in whatever way mythological thinking understands things, that meadowsweet belonged in the making of a person, that it contributed something that oak alone and broom alone could not provide. The sweetness, perhaps, the scent that makes the heart merry, the fragrance that gladdens the senses and carries something of ease and warmth. The flower woman made from meadowsweet would carry that quality. The brightness, the intoxicating scent of something blooming at the height of the year. Later, traditions layered additional associations onto blow-dyed's flowers. Some sources connect meadowsweet syncretically with the Virgin Mary. The white blossom of the meadow becomes associated with purity and the divine feminine in its Christian register. The plant proved capacious enough to hold both meanings simultaneously, the pagan flower face and the Christian white flower. 2 different theologies drawing on the same cream, white blossoms in the same summer meadow. Contemporary Druids have offered a reading of those 3 flowers that I find genuinely illuminating. Oak flower from the high forest canopy, broom from the forest edge, the transitional zone where the canopy opens and the scrub begins. Meadowsweet from the forest floor, the damp margins at the base of everything. In this reading, blow-dyed is not simply a woman made from 3 pretty flowers. She is the whole forest. The full vertical range of a living ecosystem, from the highest canopy to the lowest wet margin, woven together into a single being. She is the land made conscious, the forest given a face and a will and the capacity to act on its own desires. She is, in other words, the sovereignty of the land in human form, and her transformation into an owl, the creature that moves through the forest at night, that sees what daylight hides, that belongs to the space between the trees, is not punishment so much as return. She was always the forest. The human form was borrowed. The owl is what she is when the borrowing is done. Meadowsweet was in her making, the wet margin plant, the stream edge plant, the lowest layer of the forest ecosystem. It contributed what it always contributes, the threshold quality, the sweetness above and the bitterness below, the scent that opens perception, all of it present in the making of a woman. Now, Ireland. In Ireland, the plant's mythological associations are both more specific and more politically interesting than the Welsh ones. They centre on Finin, the sovereignty goddess of County Limerick, whose name means brightness, radiance, the quality of light on water, the luminosity of a clear day in a landscape that is itself beautiful. In is not simply a goddess of love, though love is part of her domain. She is a sovereignty goddess. And the concept of sovereignty in Celtic tradition is not the same as political authority in any modern sense. In the Celtic world, the legitimacy of a ruler was understood to derive not only from lineage or force, it derived from the land itself. The land had a spirit, a presence, a feminine animating principle. The land was a being with preferences, with the capacity to accept or reject those who sought to rule it. The ruler who governed well was in right relationship with this principle. The land accepted them. The crops were good, the rivers clean, the cattle healthy, the people prosperous. When the relationship was wrong, when the ruler was unjust or unfit or had broken the bond, the land itself showed it. The harvests failed. The rivers ran low. The cattle sickened. This is sovereignty in the Celtic sense, not a political concept, an ecological one. The right ruler and the right land in right relationship, expressed through the fertility and beauty of the landscape itself. In is that principle made personal. She is the sovereignty of Munster, of Limerick, of the Irish landscape in its summer abundance. And she appears on Midsummer's Eve, the longest day, the turning point of the year, crowned with meadowsweet. Not with roses, not with any cultivated flower of garden and ceremony. With meadowsweet, the wild plant of the wet meadows, the one that blooms precisely at midsummer, the one that smells of summer itself. The sovereignty goddess wears the flower that marks her season, that grows in the landscape she embodies, that blooms at the moment of her greatest presence in the world. The sweet scent and the cream-white plume are expressions of joy and abundance. The land at its most generous, summer at its fullest, and the medicinal bitterness of the root, that astringency below the surface, sweetness, is the weight of sovereignty itself. The responsibilities that come with abundance, the demands the land makes on those who hold it. Sweet above, bitter below. The plant that Yorkshire called courtship and matrimony carries, in the Irish tradition, the full weight of the bond between a ruler and the earth they are trusted to tend. One Irish telling goes further. Still, in herself, gave meadowsweet its fragrance. The scent is not a botanical accident, it is a gift, a trace of the goddess left in the plant as evidence of her passage through, her attention to, her particular pleasure in this one flowering thing. Every time you bend over a wet meadow and breathe in that sweet green almond scent, you are breathing something placed there deliberately by someone divine, as a token of something that mattered to them. The smell is a signature. The plant is a message. This framing transforms the experience of encountering meadowsweet in the field. You are not simply smelling a pleasant wildflower. You are smelling a gift, something left for you and for everyone who came before you, by a presence that understood what it was leaving and why. The hill of Knockany, Tavnok Signog. In Irish, Freenlin's Hill in County Limerick was the site of midsummer ceremonies enacted in her honor. The records of these ceremonies are not ancient manuscripts. They are ethnographic observations from 1879. People living in the landscape where Frieden's tradition was strongest were still, in the late 19th century, performing the rites associated with her at midsummer. Still climbing the hill, still carrying light, still using the plant. The ceremony was this. Men would tie bunches of straw and hay onto poles. These were called 50 flifances, and light them. They would carry the burning 50 faras sifa in procession clockwise around the 3 barrows at the top of the hill. The barrows known locally as the hills of the 3 ancestors. Then they would bring the Sundi Sudiyars down through their fields and between their cattle to bring good fortune to the animals and the crops. This was understood as emulating what the fairies themselves did under Sidin's direction when the humans had withdrawn. And meadowsweet. Meadowsweet was gathered on Midsummer's Eve specifically for protection against the fairies who were understood to be particularly active on that night. It was known locally as Agid Luakra, silver of the rush, the silver plant of the wetlands. It was placed on windowsills, worn by women, and garlanded on animals as a defense against fairy interference on the most dangerous night of the year. Hold these two things together. The same plant associated with Thetin worn as her crown, given its fragrance by her gift, was used on Midsummer's Eve to protect against the very being she was said to lead. The plant of the sovereignty goddess was the protection against the sovereignty goddess's own people. This is not a contradiction. This is the logic of threshold plants at its most precise. Fwynn's plant marks the boundary placed at the window, the threshold of the house. It says, here is the limit of your authority. Here is where the inside world ends and the outside world begins. The same plant on the crown of the goddess and on the windowsill against her people. Not different uses, the same use working in both directions. There is another sovereignty goddess whose connection to meadowsweet is less often noted but equally interesting. Med. The Irish sovereignty goddess whose name means she who intoxicates, whose name is cognate with the Old English Fremandosh, mead, and with the Proto-Celtic root from which all the mead words of the Northern European languages ultimately derive. Medb is the goddess of mead in its deepest mythological sense, not of the drinker's beverage, of the drinker's sovereignty itself. The mead she offered granted the right to rule. It was given in the inauguration of ancient Irish kings, a ceremonial cup extended by the goddess of the land to the man who wished to hold it in trust. Meadowsweet was the mead herb, the plant that gave the drink its scent and its character. And mead was sovereignty, which means that the plant, the drink, and the right to rule were, in the deepest Irish mythological understanding, a single interconnected thing. You cannot fully separate them. The scent of meadowsweet in the fermentation vat was not merely flavoring, it was the sovereignty goddess entering the drink. The land's beauty made soluble, made drinkable, made transferable from one holder to the next in the ceremony of the cup. When the king accepted the mead from Medb's hands, he was accepting the land itself in its summer fragrance, in its cream, white flowering, in its particular and unmistakable scent. This is the deepest layer of why meadowsweet was placed in Bronze Age graves, in those vessels of honey mead whose residues the chemists have found. It was not merely a pleasant drink for the journey. It was the sovereignty of the land, offered one final time to someone who was leaving it. The Irish tradition also links meadowsweet with Aengus, the young love god, the one who pursues the heart's desire across impossible distances and through impossible obstacles, whose own great love story is one of the most beautiful in Irish mythology. Aengus searches for the woman he has seen only in dreams. He follows her across the full reach of Ireland, waits for the one day in the year when her enchantment shifts and she can be reached. He is desire made divine, not lust, not possession, but the profound longing that orients a life toward something essential. Meadowsweet in this frame becomes the plant of the heart's wanting, of joy in its purest and most vulnerable form. And also, given the plant's characteristic duality of the tenderness that follows joy, the bittersweet quality of having been fully happy and knowing that happiness is not a permanent condition, the flower's sweetness and the root's astringency, the longing and the finding and the knowledge always present in the background, that what is found can also be lost. Now, C.C. Tulane, with a detail worth dwelling on. In the Irish tradition, meadowsweet was sometimes called sometime prios, shorcha cholan, sorta cholan's belt, not merely associated with him or used in his treatment, named for him, named for the place on his body where he carried it. After his people discovered that meadowsweet could cool his battle rages, he carried it in his belt, close to his body, available immediately, the plant literally worn as part of the warrior's equipment alongside the weapons. Think about what it means for a warrior culture to name a plant for the place a hero carries it. Not Sisir Chulan's shield, not Sisir Chulan's sword, Chulan's belt. The thing that holds the warrior together, the thing worn closest to the body's center, the thing that is always present rather than drawn only in battle. The meadowsweet that cools the rage, that brings the hero back to himself, that makes the dangerous thing manageable, was understood as so essential to the functioning of the greatest warrior in Irish mythology that it was named for where he kept it. Part of the equipment of a hero, not decorative, necessary. At the summer solstice, the longest day, the fullness of the year, people gathered meadowsweet and strewed it in celebration, offered it to the summer deities, wore it in garlands as the season reached its peak. And at Lunasad, the harvest festival, the garlands of meadowsweet connected the wearer to the turning of the wheel, to the moment when abundance begins its slow shift toward the quieter months. The plant that marks midsummer is also the plant worn as the year begins to turn. It holds both poles of the season simultaneously. The wedding association runs through all of this. Meadowsweet strewn on the ground at weddings and joyful gatherings. Its scent believed to promote love and happiness. Its presence at the ceremony understood as more than decorative. The folk name bridewort encodes a practice serious enough to generate a name. This is the bride's plant, the wedding herb, the thing that belongs at the ceremony of joining as surely as the spoken words and the witnesses. At a wedding, meadowsweet on the floor meant something. It was not garnish. It was participant. The scent at a wedding is also the scent of the midsummer feast, also the scent of the mead hall, also the scent placed in the Bronze Age grave. Every significant moment carried the same fragrance, the same plant at every threshold, at every place where one state gave way to another, and the crossing needed to be marked. Now, the shadow side, because there is one, and in a plant that's fully woven into human life, into birth and marriage and death and ceremony and medicine and food and the mythology of sovereignty and love, there must be one. Nothing with this much presence in human culture is purely benign. Everything that touches the deepest things also carries a capacity for danger. In parts of Wales and elsewhere across Britain and Ireland, the folklore is unambiguous. Sleeping in a room or a field filled with meadowsweet can cause a sleep from which you do not wake. Not ordinary sleep. Not the refreshing rest that a cooling, soothing plant might reasonably induce. A deep sleep, a year-long sleep, a death sleep, the kind that crosses a boundary not meant to be crossed, that takes the sleeper somewhere beyond the reach of ordinary waking, into whatever lies on the other side of the threshold this plant has always guarded. Some accounts describe it as deep and fatal. Others give it the quality of enchantment rather than death, a year-long trance. A sleep that looks like death but from which the sleeper may, under the right circumstances, return. Both versions share the central feature: too much meadowsweet in too enclosed a space, breathed too deeply for too long, carries the sleeper across a line that should not be crossed. In Icelandic folklore, meadowsweet is linked with fairies and with dangerous enchanted sleep. The same motif appearing at the far northern reach of the plant's range as appears in Wales. This is not one community's idiosyncratic belief. This is a pattern distributed across the full width of Northern European tradition, from Iceland to Wales, from the Norse world to the Celtic one, all pointing at the same quality in the same plant. The scent that grants second sight. The scent that, in the right conditions and the right quantity, opens perception toward the other world, toward the fairies, toward whatever dimension of experience lies adjacent to ordinary waking life. Some accounts describe not simple second sight, but double vision, an enhanced perception of the other world, alongside ordinary seeing, the two dimensions present simultaneously, rather than one replacing the other. This is the plant's otherworld capacity, the same fragrance that makes the heart merry, that gladdens the senses, that carries the scent of summer across a wet meadow, in different concentrations, in different contexts. This fragrance opens doors that are usually closed. And the Irish tradition put this capacity to use rather than simply fearing it. If someone was wasting away from fairy influence, that particular gradual decline attributed to too close an encounter with the other world, to having been touched or taken or claimed by what lives on the other side of the boundary, meadowsweet placed under their bed was said to cure them. The plant that could carry you toward the other world could also bring you back from it, the same power operating in both directions, the direction determined by intention and manner of use. It is a threshold plant. It lives at boundaries between meadow and water, between midsummer and the beginning of autumn, between the living and the dead. Threshold plants work in both directions. They can open the door or close it. They can carry you across or bring you back. The skill is in knowing which you need and how to ask for it. In parts of Britain, bringing fresh meadowsweet into the house was thought to bring very bad luck. This sits uneasily alongside its common use as a strewing herb on the floors of those same houses. And the contradiction is instructive. The strewn herb is distributed, diffused, present throughout the space in the concentration that pleases and benefits. The fresh bunch brought in and kept as a bunch is concentrated, a dense local accumulation of the plant's volatile compounds in one spot, too much of it in one place. The threshold, opening quality concentrated rather than spread. The same thing, in different quantities, is a different thing. The tradition found this principle through experience rather than through chemistry, and encoded it in a rule whose logic is perfectly sound, even if its vocabulary is different from ours. In parts of Britain and Ireland, meadowsweet was used as a funeral herb, to scent the air around the dead, to be offered at the grave, to smooth the passage of the newly dead toward whatever came next. This is continuous with the Bronze Age burial evidence, the same association persisting across 3,000 years of changing everything else. The plant at the threshold of death, the plant offered to those who were crossing. And if the plant belongs to the funeral, then the taboo about bringing it into the house makes a different kind of sense. Not bad luck in some vague and superstitious sense, something more specific. The plant that belongs with the dead should not be kept casually among the living. It has a proper context and a proper use outside that context, concentrated in a domestic space where people sleep and eat and live their daily lives. It brings what it is associated with. It brings the atmosphere of its proper place, the threshold, the passage, the deep sleep that may or may not end. Sleep is the closest the living come to death in ordinary experience. Every night, consciousness withdraws from the world. The body remains, but the person in any meaningful sense is somewhere else, in a state that looks from the outside like a small rehearsal for the final departure. The tradition has always known this. Sleep and death are related. The same plant that smooths the passage into one, smooths the passage into the other. Meadowsweet at the wedding and meadowsweet at the funeral. Meadowsweet in the marriage bed and meadowsweet in the grave. The same plant at both ends of the human passage, holding both poles simultaneously, refusing to be only one thing or the other. The tradition that says you must not sleep in a field of meadowsweet is the same tradition that uses meadowsweet to help the dead on their way. It is not contradicting itself. It is saying this plant knows the road between life and death. It has always known it. Treat it accordingly. Use it with understanding of what it is, not with a carelessness appropriate to something merely decorative or merely pleasant. There is a pharmacological reading of all of this that is not incompatible with the mythological one. The volatile compounds in meadowsweet, the aromatic chemistry that produces that distinctive sweet almond scent, are physiologically active. in high concentrations in enclosed spaces. They are genuinely sedating. This is measurable. The plant does something to the nervous system of those who breathe it in quantity. It has always done this. The tradition noticed and built around the observation, the explanatory structure available to it. But I do not think the pharmacological reading replaces the mythological one. The tradition was not simply trying to explain a physiological effect in the vocabulary of fairy stories. It was saying something true about the plant's nature, that it operates at boundaries, that it has a capacity to alter states of consciousness and perception, that it belongs in the company of the dead as well as the living, that its sweetness and its danger are not separate qualities but aspects of the same thing. The mythology is not a primitive version of the pharmacology. It is a different kind of knowledge about the same plant, concerned with different questions, arriving at truths that the pharmacology does not address and cannot replace. The plant that Samin crowned herself with on Midsummer's Eve, the plant that made Blodaude human, the plant whose local name was Silver of the Rush, worn on windowsills against the fairies on the most dangerous night of the year, and worn as a crown by the goddess those fairies served. The plant carried in the belt of the greatest warrior in Irish mythology, because without it the warrior could not safely be himself. The plant that carried the honoured dead from the Welsh cairn into whatever came after in a vessel of meadow-sweet mead. The plant that could open the other world or close it, depending on how you held it. The sweet scent is real, the danger is real, the wedding and the funeral are both real. The sovereignty goddess crowned with midsummer flowers and the bronze vessel of meadow-sweet mead sealed into the darkness of the cairn are both real. The plant holds all of it. It always has. The names people gave meadowsweet are a small archive of everything the culture felt about it. Not the formal names, the Latin names and the official common names are their own kind of record, and we have already walked through them. I mean, the folk names, the ones that arose in particular places, in particular communities, from the accumulated experience of people who lived alongside this plant through many seasons and found it necessary to say more than one thing about it. The names that did not spread to general use because they were too specific, too local, too dependent on a particular way of knowing the plant to translate easily across boundaries. Each one is a compressed story. Bridiut. This name appears in records stretching back several centuries, and its meaning is both straightforward and beautiful. The bride's plant, the herb of weddings and marriage celebrations, strewn on the floor at the ceremony, woven into garlands, worn by the wedding party, present in the church and the hall. The bridal association of meadowsweet is ancient and was serious. This was not decoration in the manner of a florist choice. This was the plant that belonged at the marriage, the way certain words and certain gestures belonged. Its presence meant something. The name preserved that meaning. Bridgework carries a different resonance, not the bride, but the bridge. The crossing place, the liminal threshold where one state gives way to another. Marriage is a crossing. The space between life and death is a crossing. The boundary between the meadow and the stream is a crossing. The plant that grows at that last threshold, that was used at marriages and in burial rites, that could open the way to the other world or close it, is appropriately named for the crossing itself. The bridge plant, the threshold herb. This is a name that understands the plant's full nature, not only its pleasant associations. Bride of the meadow, queen of the meadow, lady of the meadow. These names acknowledge what is botanically obvious, that in the wet grasslands of northern summer, meadowsweet presides. It is taller than almost everything growing around it in that habitat. It is more fragrant. It blooms at the height of the year. It makes its presence known to every sense simultaneously. Sight, smell, the slight give of damp ground underfoot as you approach it. The titles are not hyperbole. They are botanical description in the vocabulary of social hierarchy, which is the vocabulary cultures have always used when they want to say that something deserves more attention and more respect than ordinary things receive. Blackin. Gers, a Scottish name, more obscure than the others, and worth noting for what it suggests, that even in traditions that loved this plant, that gathered it and drank it and strewed it and wore it, there was an awareness of its darker aspect. The gers is the grass, the green of the ordinary world, and blackin, darkening, shadowing, the plant that darkens the grass, the plant that stands above it and casts its shadow. Not sinister, exactly, but not simple either. Now, see bittersweet, and its fullest explanation, which comes from Yorkshire. In Yorkshire, meadowsweet was known as a sea courtship and matrimony. The reasoning was stated with a kind of wry local clarity that requires no embellishment. The flowers are honeyed and sweet, representing the pleasure of courtship, the newness, the anticipation, the honeyed promise of what love might become. And the root is bitter, representing the realities of marriage, the long commitment, the adjustment of expectations, the discovery that the person you chose is a full and complicated human being, rather than the idealized creature of the courtship phase. Sweet above, bitter below. The same plant, the same organism, rooted in the same wet ground, one end of it delightful, intoxicating, the thing you lean toward and breathe in, the other end demanding, astringent, the thing you discover only when you dig down into what is actually there. It is difficult to imagine a more compressed or more accurate description of the institution of marriage. Whoever arrived at this name, whatever woman or man in whatever Yorkshire village, had observed both the plant and the institution with equal honesty and found that they illuminated each other. This is folk wisdom at its sharpest, not sentimental, not cynical, simply true. The Victorians had their own relationship with meadowsweet, and it was characteristically complicated. In one direction, the bridal associations were enthusiastically embraced. Meadowsweet appeared in wedding arrangements and bridal garlands. Its folk name bridewort was understood in the language of flowers as suggesting the message, "Send let us marry," a flower carrying a proposal in its cream-white blossoms. The soft petals fitted the Victorian aesthetic of female purity and domestic sweetness without difficulty. And yet, in Kate Greenaway, formalized language of flowers, that elaborate Victorian system for encoding emotion in bouquets, popularized in the 1870s and taken seriously as a social code. Meadowsweet was assigned the meaning of uselessness. Uselessness? I want to let that sit for a moment. For a plant that had been medicinally active for 3,000 documented years. For a plant that the Druids counted among their 3 most sacred herbs. For a plant that Elizabeth I refused to have absent from her chambers. For a plant that Harpurstring prescribed with clinical precision in the 13th century. For a plant whose midsummer presence linked land, ruler, and goddess in the sovereignty rights of Ireland. For a plant that would, within a few decades of Greenaway's publication, provide the chemical naming foundation for the most widely used medicine in human history. Uselessness? The Victorians were wrong about this in a manner so comprehensive that it is almost instructive. The language of flowers was an aesthetic and social system. It was concerned with sentiment and symbol and the performance of feeling, not with what plants actually did. In that frame, a common meadow plant with modest white flowers could be classified as useless without any contradiction, because the frame was not asking what the plant was useful for. The frame was wrong. The plant was not. John Gerard, the 16th century herbalist, wrote about meadowsweet with an enthusiasm that pushes past clinical observation into something more personal. In his great Fitty Herbal, of 1597, he wrote that the leaves and flowers far excel all other strewing herbs. For the smell thereof, he said, makes the heart merry and joyful, and delighteth the senses. The heart merry. This is not the language of a man reporting second-hand. This is the language of someone who had stood in a room where meadowsweet had been strewn, had breathed in that combination of sweet and almond and green, and felt something shift in his chest, some lightening, some settling, something he could only call merriness of the heart because he had no more precise vocabulary for it. Perhaps no more precise vocabulary was needed. The heart was merry, the senses were delighted. That was the experience accurately reported by a man who spent his working life paying close attention to plants and what they did to the people who used them. Gerard was not given to exaggeration in his botanical writing. When he reached for language like this, it was because the language was earned. And meadowsweet had earned it. The strewing herb tradition Gerard was writing within is older than Gerard and was entirely active in his time. Floors covered with aromatic plants, scattered fresh or dried, crushed underfoot with every step, releasing their compounds into the air throughout the day and into the evening. The practice was practical and ceremonial simultaneously, as so many of the best practices are. It freshened air that would otherwise carry the accumulated smells of daily life in spaces without modern ventilation or sanitation. It discouraged the insects that were endemic to every household of the period. And it did something else, something harder to name and easier to feel, that the people who lived in those spaces noticed and valued and described, when they described it at all, in language very like Gerard's. The room smelled better, and the people in it felt better. These were not experienced as two separate effects. They were one experience. Meadowsweet was among the most valued of all the strewing herbs for this purpose, not simply for its practical properties, though those were real and noted, but for this particular quality of what it did to the mood of a space. The cheerfulness, the strengthening of the heart, the sense that the room itself had become more hospitable to well-being. Queen of the meadow in the wet field, lady of the meadow at the stream's edge, and in the house, strewn across the floor, the same plant performing a different service, not presiding over the landscape, but presiding over the domestic space, making it a place where the heart found it easier to be at ease. The folk tradition preserved the same understanding in different registers across the same centuries. When strewn about a house, meadowsweet was said to bring peace, not merely a pleasant smell, but a condition, a quality of the space itself, in which things settled and what was agitated found it easier to become calm. This is a specific claim, not that it smelled nice, which anyone could observe, but that the quality of life in the space was improved, that the people in it moved through their days with less friction, more ease, more of whatever it is that peace actually feels like from the inside. In Scotland, it appeared in love potions and baths, combining its cooling physical action with its emotional one, the reduction of heat and inflammation alongside the warming and gladdening of the spirit. The paradox that has always been present in this plant operating here in its most intimate form, a person stepping into a bath prepared with meadowsweet, the scent rising with the steam, the cooling astringency working on the skin while the fragrance worked on whatever the fragrance works on. The heart-chilling scent and the emotional balm simultaneously. Not two treatments, but one, in the way that this plant has always refused to allow its physical and emotional effects to be separated. It cools the feverish body while gladdening the heart. It reduces the physical temperature while raising the emotional one, because the physical and the emotional have never been as separate as they might appear. In the contemporary magical tradition, this understanding is preserved and extended into new forms while remaining recognizably the same thing. Modern practitioners describe meadowsweet's properties as harmony, love, peace, and protection. They recommend it for reconciliation and relationship healing, for communication between people who have lost the thread of understanding between them, for the restoration of emotional balance in those who have been carrying too much for too long, for the particular kind of healing that happens not dramatically or suddenly, but gradually, through the persistent, gentle presence of something that keeps reminding the person of what ease feels like. They recommend sprinkling it around the home or ritual space to beckon happiness. This phrase, beckon happiness, is worth sitting with. Not command happiness, not manufacture it, or force it, or summon it by will. Beckon it, create the conditions in which it finds it easy to arrive. Make the space more hospitable to it. Lower the threshold between the person and the state they are reaching for. This is Meadowsweet's mode throughout its entire history. It does not compel, it invites. It does not overpower what is present. It improves the environment until what is present finds it easier to become something better. Adding it to bath soaks and love blends and harmony jars, burning it as incense in peace rituals to soothe what is turbulent and invoke what is tranquil, using it in protection charms that guard the home while simultaneously promoting the peace that makes a home worth guarding. They describe it as softening harsh energy, bringing a floral layer of protection that works through gentleness rather than force. That phrase, gentleness rather than force, is the most accurate description of this plant's character that the contemporary tradition has produced. It is describing something that every person who ever worked with meadowsweet across every century of its documented use has encountered and tried in whatever vocabulary was available to them to express. The deity associations in the contemporary magical tradition have expanded well beyond the Celtic world. Modern sources link meadowsweet with Fimdin and Blodide, as we have already traced in some detail, but also with Aphrodite, with Venus, with Eros, with Cupid, with Gwina, the Celtic love goddess, and the Greek love goddess, and the Roman love goddess, and the gods of desire, in their multiple classical forms. Meadowsweet placed at the center of a web of love deities, spanning the full reach of Western European mythology. Its associations extending outward from the Celtic heartland, where we first encountered them, into the wider mythological inheritance of the whole continent. What this expansion reflects is not carelessness, or the blurring of distinct traditions into a vague whole. It is recognition. The quality this plant embodies, the heart-gladdening, the peace-bringing, the gentle warming of what has grown cold or closed, belongs to no single tradition's understanding of love. It belongs to love itself. Every culture that has tried to name what love requires, what conditions allow it to flourish, what the atmosphere of a life well loved actually feels like, has reached for something like what this plant provides. The plant linked specifically with the heart chakra, the energy center associated with love, compassion, and the capacity to give and receive affection, is the same plant that Gerard described as making the heart merry. Different framework, different vocabulary, the same observation about the same plant, doing the same thing to the same part of the human experience. The plant for emotional healing, for the person whose heart has been closed by grief or fear or the accumulated weight of difficult experience, and who needs something to gently, persistently, fragrantly remind it how to open again. Not by force, not by instruction, but by the slow, patient, sweet-scented presence of something that knows what open feels like and keeps offering that knowledge until the heart remembers it too. Its primary magical virtues, happiness, love, peace, protection, are the same virtues it has carried since before anyone wrote them down. The contemporary tradition did not invent them. It inherited them, recognized them, and found new ways to work with them in a changed world. The forms change. The understanding does not. What runs through all of this, through the love potions and the strewing herbs and the harmony jars and the heart chakra and the brightening flower of contemporary ritual, is a single consistent character that has never wavered across the full length of this plant's relationship with human life. Meadowsweet works by creating an environment. Not by forcing an outcome, not by overpowering what is present and replacing it with something else, by modifying the quality of the space, the air, the atmosphere, the mood, the subtle tone of a room or a relationship or a person's interior weather, in the direction of something better, sweeter, more open, more at ease, more hospitable to whatever is good, and less hospitable to whatever is harsh. Gerard felt it in 1597 and called it merriness of the heart. The Bronze Age mourner felt it 3,000 years earlier and put the mead in the grave. The Scottish healer felt it and put it in the bath. The contemporary practitioner feels it and adds it to the harmony jar. All of them reaching for the same plant, all of them finding the same thing, all of them trying in the vocabulary of their own time and place to describe what it is like when the heart is reminded of what it is capable of. The tradition has not changed, it has simply changed hands. Many times, across many centuries, through many different vocabularies and frameworks and forms of practice. And each time, the plant has done what it has always done, quietly, without drama, with a particular steadiness of something that has been doing this work since before anyone thought to give it a name. The protection that meadowsweet offered was never purely spiritual in the formal sense of that word. It was always both things at once. The scent that discouraged insects was the same scent that gladdened the heart. The compounds that helped stave off infection were carried in the same volatile oils that opened perception and steadied the nervous system. The act of strewing the herb on the floor was simultaneously a practical act of household management and something that looked, to anyone paying attention, very much like the laying down of a protective boundary. Purification and protection and the simple improvement of a room's smell were not three separate practices. They were one practice, understood differently by different kinds of minds, producing effects that none of those minds could fully separate from each other, even if they wanted to. Modern practitioners work within this same understanding when they describe meadowsweet as softening harsh energy, when they use it in protection charms and amulets to guard the home while simultaneously promoting peace, when they burn it as incense in rituals for tranquility, to soothe what is turbulent and cool what is overheated. The cooling signature runs through all of it. Every application of meadowsweet in the magical tradition echoes what the medical tradition has always known about this plant's energetic character. It is cooling and drying. It reduces excess heat. It brings down what has risen too high, whether that is a fever in the body, inflammation in the joints, agitation in the mind, harshness in the emotional atmosphere of a space, or the turbulent emotion that makes it impossible to think clearly or feel steadily. The same action. In the body, in the room, in the ritual space. When it is described in pagan lore as protecting against evil influences and promoting love, balance, and harmony, continuing its role as a sacred druid herb, this is not a new understanding layered onto an older plant. It is the same understanding expressed in the vocabulary of a living contemporary tradition that draws consciously on the lineage we have been tracing throughout this entire story. The Druids counted it sacred. The medieval householder strewed it on the floor. The contemporary ritualist burns it as incense. 3 different practices, 3 different centuries, 3 different frameworks of meaning. One plant, one consistent character. Some ritualists pair its bright and sweet quality specifically with inner strength work. Not joy as a superficial thing, not the performance of happiness or the pretending away of difficulty, but the deeper resilience that allows a person to face what is hard without being destroyed by it. The flower that softens grief, that supports the person moving through a difficult season, not by pretending the difficulty is not there, but by maintaining alongside it the knowledge that the difficulty is not the only thing, that the world still contains sweetness, that the heart is still capable of being gladdened, that summer still comes, and the cream-white plumes still stand above the wet grass, and the scent still carries across the water. This is what meadowsweet has always offered, to the grieving, to the frightened, to the exhausted. Not an answer, to the difficulty, a companion through it. On Walpurgisnacht, the eve of the 1st of May, the old festival of the turning towards summer, the threshold between the cold half of the year and the warm. Love magic performed with meadowsweet was said to attract a romantic mate. The threshold plant at the threshold of the season. Again, the pattern holds without fail. Meadowsweet appears in its magical uses at the same moments it appears in its historical and mythological ones at the turnings, at the significant moments, at the places in the calendar where something is changing and the change needs to be marked and supported. Midsummer, Lunarsad, Walpurgisnacht, the solstice, the harvest, the beginning of summer's approach. At every hinge in the year, the plant that grows at hinges. The divination uses are among the most practically specific in the entire folk tradition. In British and Welsh lore, a sprig of meadowsweet placed in water will sink if a thief is male and float if female. The oracle for a very concrete problem. A theft has occurred. The community is disturbed. The matter needs resolution. Someone brings the plant to a bowl of water and watches what it does. The answer rises or descends with the sprig. Whether or not this worked in any measurable sense, the logic behind it is worth understanding rather than dismissing. A plant trusted with illness, with fever, with the most serious passages of human life, with birth and marriage and death and the protection of the home and the sovereignty of the land. Such a plant could be trusted to answer a practical question about the living. Trust is earned and then extended. This is how folk knowledge works. Not by strict separation of domains, but by the natural extension of demonstrated trustworthiness into adjacent situations. The plant that knows the road between life and death probably knows something about the smaller questions too. There is a Russian folktale that carries the plant's character into an unexpected register. A knight named Kudryash, fearful, paralyzed by his own fear, unable to do what courage requires of him, and through association with meadowsweet, he regains his bravery. This is not the same mechanism as the C.C. Chulin story, where the plant cools in excess. There the problem was too much heat, too much rage. The warrior overwhelmed by the force of his own battle fury. Here the problem is too little. Not the heat of rage, but the cold of fear. Not excess, but absence. And the plant that cools excess also addresses absence. Because what meadowsweet restores, in both cases, is balance. The warrior back to himself after the rage has been cooled. The knight back to himself after the fear has been warmed through. The same mechanism operating in opposite directions, because the mechanism is not specifically cooling or warming, but regulating, returning the person to a right relationship with their own capacities, removing whatever has accumulated, heat or cold, excess or deficit, and allowing what is natural and native to the person to resume. The plant does not transform the person. It removes the obstruction between the person and what they already are. Contemporary nature, spiritual writers describe meadowsweet as a brightening flower, a strong, uplifting scent, a common choice in rituals for joy and emotional lightening when the weight of things has become too heavy to carry easily. Brightening is the right word for it. Not illuminating, that suggests revelation. The sudden sharp light of something newly understood. Brightening is slower. Gentler, the gradual lifting of what has been dim, the room that was grey becoming, over time, something closer to what a room should be. The person who was heavy becoming, over time, something closer to their own weight. The heart that was closed beginning, in the persistent, sweet-scented presence of this plant, to remember that it knows how to open. By the medieval period, all of this had settled into the formal practice of the strewing herb. In medieval Europe, meadowsweet was a common household and church strewing herb, scattered on floors to scent the air, discourage lice and fleas, and help counter infection. This was not a fringe practice. This was standard domestic management across the full width of European society. from the humblest cottage to the grandest hall, from the village church to the cathedral. The strewing of aromatic herbs was one of the things that distinguished a well-managed household from a poorly managed one. And meadowsweet was among the most valued of all the herbs used for this purpose. Its long-standing use as a strewing herb in homes and churches is now reread in combined historical and magical narratives as an early form of purification and protection magic, a practice where scent, cleanliness, and spiritual safeguarding blur into one. This rereading is not a distortion. It is an accurate description of what the practice was, seen whole rather than through a single lens. The people scattering meadowsweet across their floors were doing all of these things with a single gesture. They were not choosing between the practical and the sacred. The plant did not require them to. In the 14th century, Chaucer knew it. He mentions medwort, meadowsweet, as one of the ingredients in a medicinal drink called Forty Salvae. Chaucer was not writing an herbal. The plant receives no special attention in the mention. It is there because it was there in the drink, because his readers would have known exactly what it was, because by the 14th century meadowsweet was sufficiently embedded in English culinary and medicinal use that a poet could name it in passing, without pausing to explain it. The word needed no gloss. Everyone recognized it. This is the measure of an established plant, not that it is praised, but that it is assumed. And then there is Elizabeth I. Elizabeth I of England reigned from 1558 to 1603, 45 years during which she held together a kingdom under extraordinary pressures, managing the competing demands of religion and politics and international relations with intelligence and caution and theatrical confidence that her contemporaries found both admirable and baffling. She was a woman of strong opinions and particular preferences about many things. One of those preferences was for meadowsweet. Among all the herbs available for strewing in her private chambers, Elizabeth favored meadowsweet above all others. Above all others. In a court where the strewing of herbs was a formal and considered practice, where the Queen's chambers were managed with the same attention to protocol and preference that governed every other aspect of royal life, meadowsweet was the first choice, the preferred scent, the herb that the most powerful woman in England wanted around her when she slept, when she worked, when she received her advisors, when she was alone with her own thoughts. We do not know precisely why. She did not leave a note explaining her preference. We cannot ask her. What we can say is that the woman who managed England for nearly half a century, who was by every account a person of exceptional intelligence and attention to the world around her, chose this plant, not roses, not lavender, not any of the more conventionally prestigious options available to a queen with access to anything she wanted. Meadowsweet, the common mead herb, the plant of wet meadows and stream edges, the plant that Gerard would describe as making the heart merry, the plant that Finor as her crown, the plant that had flavored the mead at the Bronze Age burial and stood in Sishichulin's belt and been placed under the bed of the fairy sick. Elizabeth chose the plant that carried all of this and had it strewn across the floors of her private chambers and breathed it every day. Perhaps she knew exactly what she was choosing. Perhaps she simply liked the smell. Perhaps with this plant, those two things have always been the same thing. Good. I have the full style. Let me write the section now. Before the great herbalists of the 16th century sat down to write, before Culpeper and Gerard set their observations to print and gave the English-speaking world its first systematic plant portraits, there were the physicians of the North. Men who practiced in the cold latitudes, who worked with what the wet ground gave them, who wrote in Latin or in the vernacular tongues of Scandinavia, and recorded with quiet precision what they had found to be useful, and why. One of these men was Henrik Harperstring. Harpestreng was a Danish physician of the 13th century, a canon of Roskilde Cathedral, a man of learning and formal medical training in an era when the two were rarely separated. He died around 1244. He left behind a body of work in Old Danish that represents one of the earliest vernacular medical texts in Scandinavian literature. Not a translation of a classical authority, not a borrowed Latin compendium, but a practical record of what worked and what was used, written in the language of the people who would use it. And he knew meadowsweet. He knew it specifically. He knew it by the part of the plant and the method of preparation, and the nature of the complaint it was meant to address. This was not the vague mention of a plant whose properties were generally understood. This was the kind of knowledge that comes from practice, from observation, from watching what happens when you apply a thing and recording what you see. Harpestreng recommended drinking meadowsweet with wine against viper bites. This is an interesting prescription. The viper bite is not a complaint of mild inconvenience. It is a serious matter, particularly in the rural north, where adders could be encountered in the heather and marshes that meadowsweet also favored. A physician recommending meadowsweet for this purpose was not suggesting it as a comfort measure. He was placing it in the category of treatments for acute, dangerous events. He believed it had something real to offer against venom. Perhaps its diaphotic quality, its capacity to encourage perspiration and move things through the body, perhaps the anti-inflammatory property we now understand as salicylate activity, present in the plant in real and measurable quantities. He may not have known the mechanism, but he had seen the outcome often enough to write it down. And then there is the ear remedy. Harpestreng advised crushing meadowsweet seeds in oil and dripping this preparation into aching ears. Here, the specificity is striking, not the flowers, not the leaves, not the root. The seeds, a particular part of the plant prepared in a particular way, applied to a particular complaint by a particular root. This is not folklore in the dismissive sense that word sometimes carries. This is systematic observation refined into method. You do not end up with a seed oil ear preparation by accident. You end up with it by trying several things and finding that this one works better than the others, and then teaching that finding to your students and writing it down so it survives you. The seeds crushed in oil, dripped into the aching ear. 13 centuries ago. Beyond Harpestreng, the Northern European folk record extends in every direction, older than any text passed in the practical memory of households that never thought to write anything down, because writing was not how you kept knowledge then. You kept it by using it, by passing it from the person who knew to the person who needed to know, in the kitchen, in the field, at the bedside. One of the simplest and most persistent uses in this tradition was the cloth remedy for colds. Meadowsweet juice, the expressed liquid of the fresh plant, was applied to a cloth. The cloth was held near the face and the vapor inhaled. This is a decongestant application, a way of using the plant's volatile compounds, the same compounds that produce the sweet complex scent of the flowering plumes, as something the airways could receive directly, not swallowed, not applied to skin. Breathed drawn in through the nose and throat where the cold had taken hold. It is a modest and elegant use. There is no preparation beyond expressing the juice, no fire, no pot, no grinding. Just the plant and the cloth and the breath. The kind of remedy that can be assembled in a few minutes by anyone who knows where to find meadowsweet in July, which in a Northern European farming community would have been essentially everyone. The knowledge was not specialized, it was common. That is the mark of a plant that has genuinely entered a culture's daily life. Not that the physician knows it, but that the farmer's wife knows it. That the knowledge is so widely held, it requires no instruction. You grow up knowing meadowsweet for colds, the way you grow up knowing to put dock leaves on nettle stings. It is simply part of what you know about where you live. The topical applications in the northern tradition are equally revealing. Crushed roots were applied for eye diseases. The same crushed roots were mixed with vinegar and applied to frostbitten feet. These are two entirely different complaints, addressed with the same raw material, the root macerated and the range of applications suggests a confidence in the plant's general capacity to reduce inflammation and restore circulation. The eye is an inflamed and sensitive organ. Frostbitten feet are a problem of impaired circulation and damaged tissue. The plant was understood, in some functional, if pre-scientific sense, as something that helped the body recover from states of damage and excess, cold, inflammation, trauma to tissue. Leaves and roots were also used as compressors on wounds and as patches applied directly to gouty joints. The wound compress is a vulnerary application, something to help damaged skin close and heal. The gout patch is an anti-inflammatory one. Both are uses that make sense in the light of what we now know about the salicylate compounds the plant contains. Both were documented in the folk record long before any chemist had extracted or named those compounds. The people who used meadowsweet this way did not know why it worked. They knew that it did. That knowledge was enough. That knowledge was, in its own way, everything. The formal apothecary record of the 16th and 17th centuries takes these folk uses and places them in a different register, written, systematic European in scope. By this period, historical sources already document meadowsweet explicitly as a diuretic and anti-inflammatory remedy, not as a local curiosity or a peasant preparation, but as a recognized article of the formal pharmacopoeia, something an apothecary could expect to be asked for, something a physician could prescribe without needing to explain his reasoning to a colleague, because the colleague would already understand a diuretic, something that moves fluid through the kidneys and encourages its release, a useful property in cases of swelling, in cases of what the old physicians called dropsy, the accumulation of fluid in the tissues that we now understand as oedema, an anti-inflammatory, something that reduces the heat and swelling of inflamed tissue, that makes the gout swollen joint less agonizing, that lowers the heat of fever by some mechanism the old writers could describe in effects even if they could not explain in causes. Both of these uses point to the same underlying chemistry, the same salicylate compounds, the same capacity that would, 3 centuries later, be extracted, synthesized, modified, and sold as aspirin to a world that had forgotten where the idea came from. But we are not at aspirin yet. We are in the apothecary's shop, with the dried plant in a jar on the shelf and the physician's letter on the counter. And the use is already old. Traditional Persian medicine, which had its own long relationship with European botanical knowledge through the shared Arabic and Greek classical sources, also used meadowsweet for fever, for pain, for inflammatory diseases. The Persian tradition was not drawing on the same direct folk knowledge as the Danish or English traditions. It was drawing on a parallel pharmacopoeia shaped by different hands, different texts, different climates, but arriving at the same plant and many of the same uses. That convergence is significant. When separate traditions, working independently in different parts of the world, arrive at the same plant for the same complaints, it suggests something beyond coincidence. It suggests that the plant's properties are real enough and consistent enough to be discovered more than once. Persian physicians looking at fever and pain found meadowsweet useful. Danish physicians looking at fever and pain found meadowsweet useful. English apothecaries looking at inflammation and fluid retention found meadowsweet useful. The plant was showing the same face to everyone who looked carefully enough. The face of something that worked. In the monastic and folk medicine of medieval Europe, meadowsweet had another specific and carefully noted application: children's diarrhea. This deserves a moment's attention. Diarrhea in children in the medieval period was not a minor inconvenience to be managed with rest and fluids. It was a genuine danger. A child with severe diarrhea in a household without clean water, without understanding of hydration, without any of the modern interventions that have made this condition routine. To treat that child was in real danger. Meadowsweet was considered particularly effective for this complaint. The astringent tannins in the plant, which we can now identify and measure, would have had a real binding effect on the gut. The anti-inflammatory compounds would have addressed whatever inflammation was driving the problem. The preparation, a tea or decoction, gentle enough for a child, was within the reach of any household that could find the plant. Monastic medicine preserved this use. The monks who maintained the herb gardens and infirmaries of medieval Europe kept the knowledge in their written records, but the folk tradition kept it too in the wordless memory of every mother who had used it and seen it work and told her daughter. So, for colds and fevers, those most universal of human miseries, the use of meadowsweet tea is documented across the full sweep of European folk tradition. The mechanism was understood in traditional terms as diaphotic, encouraging perspiration. A herb that makes you sweat was understood as something that breaks a fever, because fever that is moving, that is expressing itself outward through the skin, feels different from fever that is locked in, that cannot find its way out. Meadowsweet tea was drunk warm, at the bedside, to start the sweat, to encourage the body to resolve what it was holding. In Austria, meadowsweet tea was used for infections, for fever, for rheumatism, that broad category of painful joint and muscle complaints that did not have a more precise name, but were nonetheless extremely common in populations who worked outdoors in the cold and wet. In Scandinavia and the Baltic, the same tea was used as a mild sedative and nerve-calming remedy. Tension headaches, stress-related complaints, the kind of low-grade suffering that accumulates over days of hard physical work, and inadequate sleep, and the ordinary pressures of a life lived close to the margin. A cup of something warm and sweet-smelling that helps you sleep. That is not a sophisticated remedy. It is a human one. And Nordic, Baltic herbal producers working today still describe meadowsweet in exactly these terms as a traditional remedy for inflammation, fever, and rheumatic pain, explicitly linking their current preparations to the older European folk use. The chain is unbroken. The plant that Harpurstring knew in 13th century Roskilde, that the Austrian grandmother made into tea for a feverish child, that the Scandinavian farmer's wife pressed into a cloth and held to her aching head. That plant is still on the shelf, still in the jar, still doing what it was always found to do. And there is one more use from the Scandinavian folk record that deserves to close this section, one that is not medical at all, or not medical in the conventional sense. In some Scandinavian accounts, meadowsweet was used in bedding and stored hay, laid among the straw that people slept on, among the fodder put up for winter, not for any therapeutic reason, simply for the scent, to make the place where you slept smell of something sweet and summer-like. Perhaps also, as parallel English and Celtic practices suggest, to discourage the insects that make a bed in straw their own home. But mostly, I think, for the scent. Because the people who placed meadowsweet in their beds were not making a medical decision, they were making an aesthetic one. They were saying, I want to sleep somewhere that smells like the meadow in July. I want the last thing I breathe before I sleep to be something that reminds me that summer exists, that the wet grass and the stream edge and the tall white flowers are real, and will return even in the months when everything outside the door is dark and cold. Meadowsweet in the bedding. A small extravagance, a piece of summer kept through the winter. A plant that earned its place not only in the apothecary's jar, but in the most private and human spaces of the household, the place of sleep, of rest, of recovery. What the folk record preserved in practice. The herbalist tradition preserved in language. And the language matters because when you try to say precisely what a plant does, not just that it helps, but how it helps, and why and in what kind of person and under what kind of conditions, you are forced to develop a framework, a way of organizing what you observe into something transmissible, something a student can learn and a practitioner can apply and a patient can understand. The herbalist tradition developed exactly such a framework for meadowsweet, and the framework, once you sit with it, is remarkably coherent. The plant is described as cooling, not cold, not a plant, that chills or suppresses or shuts down, Cooling, the distinction is important. A cooling remedy in the old energetic language is one that addresses excess heat, the inflammation that burns, the fever that climbs, the gastric acid that rises beyond what the stomach lining can comfortably bear, the joint that is hot and swollen and angry to the touch. Cooling does not mean numbing. It means restoring the temperature of a system that has run too hot back towards something the body can live comfortably with. Meadowsweet is also described as drying and astringent. These two qualities are related. Dryness and astringency both act on excess moisture, on tissues that are slack or weeping or producing more fluid than serves them well. The astringent action draws tissue together, affirms what has become lax, reduces secretion where secretion has become excessive. In the gut, this addresses diarrhea, the loose, watery stool that exhausts the body in the mucous membranes of the stomach and oesophagus. It reduces the irritated, inflamed weeping of tissue that has been too long in contact with excess acid. Cooling, drying, astringent, three qualities pointing in the same direction, toward the resolution of excess of heat, of moisture, of irritation, that has accumulated beyond what the body's own mechanisms can easily correct. Modern Estonian and Nordic herbal sources are specific about where this cooling, anti-inflammatory capacity was most valued historically. Not as a general tonic, not as a pleasant addition to the medicine chest specifically. And the sources are careful about this for anti-rheumatic and pain-relieving purposes, for the complaints of the musculoskeletal system, for the particular suffering of joints and muscles that have been worked too hard in too much cold and wet. This framing makes sense in the geography. The Baltic and Nordic countries are not warm. The people who farmed and fished and worked outdoors in those latitudes spent long months in conditions that are hard on joints. The cold enters the hands. The damp settles in the knees. The back that has carried weight in the rain for 30 years begins to speak its own complaint. These were not rare or unusual presentations. They were the ordinary physical cost of ordinary life in the cold north. And meadowsweet, the plant of the wet margins and the stream edges, grew exactly where these people lived and worked. The proximity is not coincidental. Plants that grow in a place tend to be noticed and used by the people who live there. And a plant that addresses the specific physical complaints most common in a particular climate will become, over time, specifically associated with those complaints in that culture's medical memory. Rheumatism, gout, arthritic joint pain, the general category of musculoskeletal aching that does not have a more precise name but is nonetheless entirely real. These are listed across European traditions, not as marginal uses, but as primary ones. The plant that the Estonian grandmother knew for her swollen hands. The plant the Norwegian fisherman used for his aching knees. The plant the Austrian farmer's wife made into something warm and anti-inflammatory for the joints that would not whiten after a wet harvest season. The same compounds, the same salicylate chemistry, the same plant that the chemist would later ransack for the idea that became aspirin, already doing the work it would eventually be famous for, just without the factory, the patent, or the white tablet. But the joint complaints are only one part of the story. The other part, the part that the traditional herbalist literature treats with particular care and nuance, is the digestive system. And here meadowsweet occupies a position that is genuinely unusual among medicinal plants, because its action on the gut is not simple. It is not merely soothing, not merely astringent, not merely anti-inflammatory in a general sense. It is all of these things simultaneously, and the combination produces an effect that the old herbalists described with a precision that modern analysis has largely confirmed. It has been used for hyperacidity, for heartburn, for gastritis, for peptic ulcers. These are all conditions of excess acid, of the stomach producing more acid than the lining can comfortably handle, or of acid moving into places where it should not be, burning the oesophagus, irritating the stomach wall, eventually eroding it into the raw, painful open wound of an ulcer. For these conditions, meadowsweet is still described by contemporary herbalists as one of the most effective plant remedies available. Not one of the most interesting, not one of the most historically notable, one of the most effective. That is a strong claim, and it is made by practitioners who work with many plants and are not inclined toward sentimentality about any particular one. The action is described as protective of the mucosa, the lining of the stomach and esophagus and gut. The plant's tannins and flavonoids coat and soothe inflamed tissue. They reduce the irritation that has accumulated in the gut wall. They allow the lining to recover from whatever has been burning it. Whether that is excess acid, infection, or the prolonged low-grade irritation of a difficult diet and a stressful life. The astringency does something specific here. It firms the tissue that has become slack, tightens what has been loosened by inflammation, helps restore to the gut wall something of its proper integrity, its capacity to do what it is supposed to do without leaking or weeping or letting through what it should be keeping out. But here is where the analysis becomes interesting, because modern herbalists are careful to say that meadowsweet does not simply act as an antacid. It is not a plant that suppresses stomach acid the way a pharmaceutical antacid does, flooding the stomach with alkalinity and shutting down the acid-producing mechanism. The action is described, rather, as balancing both high and low stomach acid. This is a remarkable claim and worth sitting with. It suggests that the plant is not acting on the acid itself, but on the system that produces it, on the stomach's own capacity to regulate its output. Too much acid and the plant helps reduce it. Too little acid, which causes its own set of digestive problems, different in character, but equally real, and the plant helps restore it. The mechanism is not suppression, but regulation. Not the imposition of a fixed alkaline environment, but the support of the stomach's own intelligence about how much acid it actually needs. The language the old herbalists used for this was alterative. A plant that acts as an alterative drains what they called metabolic waste. The accumulated excesses and residues that accumulate in tissue when the body's normal clearing mechanisms are not working properly. The alterative does not attack the problem directly. It restores the conditions under which the body's own mechanisms can address it. This is a different kind of medicine than the pharmaceutical model. It is not aimed at a single target. It is aimed at the conditions of recovery. The upper digestive tract is where the herbalist literature places meadowsweet's primary clinical value: acid dyspepsia, reflux, the persistent discomfort of a stomach that cannot find its own equilibrium. These are not dramatic complaints. They are not life-threatening in the way that viper bites and vascular fevers are life-threatening, but they are extraordinarily common, and their commonness means that a plant which addresses them reliably has an enormous reach. Almost everyone, at some point, has had a stomach that hurt. Almost everyone has lain awake at night with heartburn, or pushed away a meal because their gut was too unhappy to receive it, or spent a day uncomfortable in a way that is difficult to explain but completely impossible to ignore. Meadowsweet, alongside chamomile and plantain, forms what modern herbalists sometimes describe as a triad of soothing, mucosa-supportive plants for the inflamed gut. 3 plants with overlapping but distinct qualities, each bringing something slightly different to the combination. A whole more complete than any one alone. Chamomile with its antispasmodic warmth, plantain with its cooling, drawing quality, meadowsweet with its astringency and its particular affinity for acid, excess, and upper digestive irritation. These 3 together are the gut's old friends. Plants that the body recognizes in some functional, if not conscious sense, as things that help. The full clinical picture of meadowsweet, assembled from traditional European and modern herbal sources together, is wider than any single organ or complaint. Diarrhea, ulcers, headache, rheumatism, stomachache, fever, indigestion, gout. The list runs across the complaints of almost every body system, with the thread connecting them being the same thread that runs through all the old uses. Excess heat, excess acid, excess inflammation, tissue that has become irritated beyond its own ability to calm itself, a system that has run too hot and cannot find its way back to a comfortable temperature without help. Some contemporary clinical herbal practice extends the list further still into areas the old herbalists would not have had the diagnostic language to name but might have recognized by their presentations. The plant is described in some modern sources as relevant to cervical dysplasia, abnormal cell changes in the cervix, which is a long way from Harperstrang's ear oil or the Austrian fever tea. But the underlying logic is consistent with the plant's known chemistry, the anti-inflammatory and tissue protective capacity that helps an irritated stomach lining recover may operate in different conditions and at different scales on other tissues under similar pressure. The plant does not change. Its chemistry does not change. What changes is our understanding of where that chemistry might be useful. The planetary association, in the old Western herbal tradition, places meadowsweet under Saturn. Saturn governs the musculoskeletal system, bones, joints, the structural architecture of the body. It is a cold, slow, contracting energy in the old elemental language. And the link to meadowsweet is made specifically in the context of rheumatic conditions where heat and dampness underlie the problem. The Saturnine framework is not about a cold remedy for a cold condition. It is about a cooling, astringent remedy that addresses the damp heat accumulating in the joints. The cold of Saturn as a corrective to the damp heat of the complaint. The dry, astringent quality of the plant as an answer to the wet, inflamed tissue of the arthritic joint. This is the kind of reasoning that can seem opaque at a distance, but is actually quite precise when you understand what the terms mean. Saturn, damp heat, cooling, astringent. These are not mystical categories. They are descriptive ones, built up over centuries of observation and organized into a framework that clinicians found useful for matching plant to patient. The patient with hot, swollen, damp joints needs something cooling, drying, and astringent. The plant that is cooling, drying, and astringent is meadowsweet. Saturn is the framework's way of saying this plant and this kind of complaint belong together. Go there first. The kidney and urinary tract are also part of meadowsweet's traditional scope. As a diuretic, a plant that supports the kidneys in moving fluid, it has been used across traditions for bladder and urinary complaints. The mechanism is gentle, not the aggressive fluid-stripping action of pharmaceutical diuretics, but the mild encouragement of a system that is sluggish, that needs support rather than forcing, fluid that has accumulated in the tissues, kidneys that are working but could be working better, the kind of low-grade urinary discomfort that accompanies cold and damp and the particular vulnerability of certain constitutions to the lower body ills. Diuretic, anti-inflammatory, astringent, mucosa, protective, vulnerary, a healer of wounds, both inside and outside the body. The same plant used internally as a tea for the irritated stomach and externally as a compress for the slow-healing wound. The same tannins, the same flavonoids, the same chemistry that protects a gut lining, also protecting the surface of skin that has been broken and is trying to close. A vulnerary is one of the oldest categories in herbal medicine. Something that helps wounds heal. The word comes from the Latin for wound. And meadowsweet has been in this category since at least the folk record of Northern Europe, the leaf compress, the root poultice, and remains there in modern herbalist descriptions, which emphasize its use for irritated mucosa both internally and as a wound-healing plant when applied externally. And then there are the preparations. Tea, tincture, bath, glycerite, oil infusion, strewing herb. The range of forms in which meadowsweet has been and continues to be used is itself a kind of testimony to the plant's versatility, to the fact that different parts of its chemistry become available through different preparations and that different complaints call for different approaches. The tea is the most familiar, hot water over dried flowers or leaves, steep gently, drunk warm. The volatile compounds in the steam carry the scent and some of the lighter chemistry. The water extracts the tannins, the flavonoids, the salicylate compounds. The warmth of the cup is itself part of the medicine. The comfort of something hot held in both hands. The gentle encouragement toward rest. The tincture preserves a wider range of compounds in alcohol, concentrating the plant's chemistry into drops that can be added to water or taken directly. The bath, meadowsweet flowers and leaves steeped in warm water and added to the bath, delivers the anti-inflammatory and skin-soothing compounds through the skin itself, diffusely over the whole body surface. For someone with rheumatic joints or skin irritation, a meadowsweet bath is a remedy that surrounds the person with the plant's action rather than delivering it to one specific point. The glycerite, the plant extracted into vegetable glycerin rather than alcohol, produces a sweet, syrupy preparation gentle enough for children. The oil infusion produces something for external application. Meadowsweet's chemistry dissolved into a carrier oil, ready to be rubbed into aching joints or applied to inflamed skin. And the strewing herb, which we have already met in the great halls and private chambers and country cottages of medieval Europe, which brings us back always to the simplest use of all, the plant in the air, the scent in the room, the chemistry of meadowsweet delivered not through the gut or the skin, but through the lungs, with every breath in the most ancient and unconsidered form of herbal medicine there is. You breathe it in. You have always breathed it in. Every person who has walked past a meadowsweet stand in flower on a July morning has already received, without knowing it, something of what the herbalist would later measure and prescribe and package, the volatile salicylates in the air, the sweet, complex scent that carries information as well as pleasure, the body responding, below the threshold of conscious attention, to something it has been responding to for a very long time. Before there was aspirin, there was the steeped flower. A handful of meadowsweet blossoms in a cup, hot water poured over them, a few minutes of waiting, and then the drink, warm and sweet-scented, taken for a headache or a general ache that had no more specific name than that. The body hurting in the way bodies hurt, and something being reached for that was known to help. This was not a sophisticated preparation. It required no equipment beyond a cup and hot water, no specialist knowledge beyond knowing which plant to pick and when, no measurement beyond a handful. It was the kind of remedy so simple and so widely understood that it barely registers in the written record, not because it was unimportant, but because it was too ordinary to require documentation. Everyone knew it. Everyone did it. The person with a headache reached for meadowsweet the way a person today reaches for a tablet from a foil strip in the kitchen drawer, automatically, without ceremony, because it was simply what you did when your head hurt and you needed it to stop. And it worked. Not because of magic or tradition or the accumulated weight of belief, though all of those things were present. It worked because of chemistry that no one in those households had named or measured or understood in any formal sense. But that was operating regardless of whether anyone understood it or not. The plant did not require understanding to do its work. It simply did it. Meadowsweet contains salicylate compounds, a family of molecules that includes salicylic acid and its various relatives present in the plant in quantities that are real and pharmacologically significant. These are the same molecular family found in white willow bark, the bark that has been used for pain and fever since antiquity, that appears in the writings of Hippocrates, in Egyptian medical papyri, older than the classical world, in the folk and formal medicine of virtually every temperate culture that had access to a willow tree and a person with a headache. The salicylate family is one of the oldest therapeutically recognized groups of compounds in human history. And meadowsweet carries them too, not identically to the willow, The specific profile of salicylate compounds differs between the two plants, as does the surrounding chemistry of tannins and flavonoids that accompanies them, but the same family, the same fundamental molecular logic, the same capacity to reduce inflammation, to lower fever, to interrupt the pain signal at a chemical level, and give the body a chance to stop hurting for long enough to begin recovering. The salicylates are why the tea reduces a headache, why the compress cools a swollen joint, why Harper-Strang's preparations worked for the complaints he so carefully recorded, why the Austrian grandmother's fever tea broke the fever that the household had been watching with worry, why the Scandinavian farmer reached for this plant specifically, and not some other when his joints ached in the cold months after harvest, why every tradition that encountered meadowsweet in the wet margins of the northern world found it useful for the same broad category of complaints: pain, heat, inflammation, fever. The chemistry was always there. The knowledge of the chemistry came later, much later. In 1839, a German botanist working in the expanding tradition of pharmaceutical chemistry, the tradition that was beginning in the 19th century to dismantle the plants that physicians had used for centuries and identify what exactly was doing the work, recognized the presence of salicin, like constituents in meadowsweet. The methodology was new, the curiosity was new, the systematic extraction. An analysis of plant compounds was a young science, barely a generation old, and it was transforming the relationship between the apothecary, S-jar, and the chemist, S-bench. What it was finding again and again was that the plants the old herbalists had used were not working by accident. They were working because of real compounds with real and describable actions. The mystery was not dissolving. It was deepening in a different direction. Not, does this plant do something? But what exactly is it doing? And why? And could we do more of it if we understood the mechanism precisely enough? The salicin-like constituents in meadowsweet provided one answer. The same family of compounds that white willow had been yielding to similar analysis, the same molecules in a different plant doing the same broad category of work. Two plants from entirely different botanical traditions, one a tree, one a streamside herb, converging on the same chemistry, and being found by cultures across the full width of Eurasia, useful for the same complaints. That convergence is not a coincidence. That is the chemistry announcing itself through the medium of human experience before anyone had the tools to see it directly. This discovery in 1839 was not yet aspirin. Aspirin would come 60 years later, in 1899, when the German pharmaceutical company Bayer synthesized acetylsalicylic acid, a chemically modified form of salicylic acid, altered to be more stable, more predictable in its dosage, and less irritating to the stomach than raw salicylic acid taken alone. The synthesis was a pharmaceutical achievement of genuine importance. It produced a compound that could be manufactured consistently, dosed precisely, and distributed at a scale no plant harvest could match. But the name it was given carried the older story within it. Aspirin, the prefix comes from spirea, the old genus name under which meadowsweet was classified before botanists reclassified it as Filipendula. Spirea ulmaria as it was known, the A at the front of aspirin, is simply a chemical prefix, a notation of the acetyl modification. But Spirea spirea, the willow bark provided the primary chemical model and the compound being modified. The meadowsweet lent its name to the finished product. Two plants, bound together in the etymology of a small white tablet that billions of people would take across the 20th and 21st centuries for headaches and fevers and joint pain, and the prevention of blood clots and the management of heart disease. A tablet that became one of the most widely used pharmaceutical substances in human history. Most of the people who took it would have no idea where the name came from. Most still do not. The meadowsweet grows in the wet margins of the stream, The aspirin is in the bathroom cabinet. The distance between them feels absolute. It is not. The salicylates in meadowsweet do not work alone. They work alongside tannins and flavonoids, a combination that produces effects more nuanced and more complete than any single isolated compound could achieve. The tannins provide the astringency, the tissue firming quality, the gut protective action that makes the whole plant safe and soothing for the stomach lining, even as it delivers anti-inflammatory activity through a different part of its chemistry. The flavonoids contribute antioxidant effects and additional anti-inflammatory activity through pathways distinct from the salicylate mechanism. The whole plant, as taken in a tea or tincture or compress, is presenting the body with a complex of compounds that work together, that moderate each other, that produce a combined effect the herbalist tradition described with some precision, even without knowing the chemistry behind it. And this is exactly where the plant diverges from the pharmaceutical product that borrowed its name and its molecular inspiration. Aspirin, isolated, modified, standardized, manufactured, acts powerfully and predictably on inflammation and pain. It does what the salicylate chemistry does, reliably and at a known dose. But it does it without everything else in the plant, without the tannins that protect the stomach lining, without the flavonoids that moderate the inflammatory response through additional pathways, without the mucilaginous and vulnerary compounds that help irritated tissue recover, rather than simply suppressing the signal that the tissue is irritated. Aspirin can cause gastric irritation. In sensitive individuals or at high doses, it can cause gastric bleeding. It does what it does to inflammation throughout the body, including the protective inflammation of the stomach's own lining, and the stomach can suffer for it. Meadowsweet, taken as a tea, is one of the traditional herbal remedies for the very stomach irritation that aspirin itself can cause. The plant that inspired the drug, soothing the damage the drug can leave behind. The herbalists who recommend it for this purpose are not being ironic. They are making a straightforward clinical observation. Meadowsweet's protective and soothing action on the gastric mucosa is real and documented. Its use alongside or after aspirin for people whose stomachs do not tolerate the pharmaceutical well is a practical application of the plant's oldest and most consistent quality, that it does not simply attack a problem, but supports the conditions under which the body can address it without being further harmed in the process. The willow gives you the sword, the meadowsweet gives you the shield. Both were always growing by the water. Both were always there. At some point, the folk remedy and the regulatory occupy the same page. That moment arrived for meadowsweet in 2011, when the European Medicines Agency published a formal assessment report on Filipendula ulmaria, its herb and its flowers, as part of the ongoing European project of evaluating traditional herbal medicines against modern standards of evidence and safety. This is not a romantic document. It is the kind of careful, qualified, formally structured text that regulatory bodies produce when they are trying to be precise about things that resist easy precision. But what it says, beneath the careful language, is significant. It says, this plant has a documented traditional medical role in France, Spain, and Germany. It says the traditional indications are real and recognizable. It says there is experimental evidence supporting several of the plant's traditional uses. And it says, in the formal language of a European herbal monograph, meadowsweet's aerial parts, the flowers and the herb, are suitable for herbal tea preparations used for symptomatic relief of minor digestive complaints for adults at defined doses. A regulatory body in 2011 recommending meadowsweet tea. Harper Strang would have found this entirely unremarkable. He had been recommending it since the 13th century. But the fact that a modern European institution, one with access to the full weight of contemporary pharmacological research, arrived at the same plant and largely the same uses is not unremarkable at all. It is the old knowledge being confirmed by a different kind of looking, the folk record and the clinical record arriving from their very different starting points at the same destination. The Emma Report's list of official traditional indications is worth reading carefully because it maps almost exactly onto the uses that appear in the folk record and the historical herbal literature. Relief of common cold symptoms, relief of minor articular pain, joint pain in plain language, facilitation of renal and digestive elimination, used as an analgesic for headaches and toothache, and separately, topical use for symptomatic treatment of minor painful joint conditions. Common cold, joint pain, digestive and kidney support, headache, toothache. External application for painful joints. This is the same list that appears in Harvestring, the same list that appears in the Austrian folk record and the Nordic Baltic tradition. The same list that Culpeper and Gerard would have recognized. The same list that the farmer's wife kept in her practical memory and the apothecary kept in his written one. The European Medicines Agency did not discover new uses for meadowsweet. It confirmed old ones. It took what the folk tradition had preserved through centuries of continuous practice and ran it through the machinery of modern evaluation and found, on the other side, that the tradition had not been wrong. The tradition had been right all along. The experimental work cited in the MA report adds another layer of confirmation, and some of it is striking in its specificity. Flower preparations, the blossoms, specifically the creamy plumes that bloom at midsummer, were found in animal studies to lower motor activity and body temperature, to reduce movement, to bring down heat. In the language of the old herbalists, this is the sedative and febrifuge action, the calming, the cooling. In the language of the laboratory, it is a measurable reduction in motor activity and core temperature. The phenomenon is the same, the vocabulary differs. The plant does not care which vocabulary you use to describe what it does. The same dossier notes potentiation of narcotic action. The flower preparations made the effects of certain sedative compounds stronger. This correlates with the folk sense of meadowsweet as a calming, sleep-supporting plant. Not a sedative in the pharmaceutical sense, not a substance that forces unconsciousness, but something that deepens and supports the body's own movement toward rest. Something that makes sleep easier to find and more complete when found. The Scandinavian tradition of placing it in bedding is not merely aesthetic. There may be a real pharmacological basis for the sense that sleeping near meadowsweet is sleeping more deeply. And then there is the stomach. The Emma report notes reduced vascular permeability in animal studies, a reduction in the leakiness of blood vessels in inflamed tissue, which is part of the mechanism behind reduced inflammation, and stomach ulcer prevention, not treatment after the ulcer has formed, prevention. The plant protecting the stomach lining before damage occurs, maintaining the integrity of the mucosa against the conditions that would otherwise erode it. This is precisely what the naturopathic and herbal traditions have been saying for a very long time. Not just that meadowsweet helps an irritated stomach, that it protects the stomach from becoming irritated in the first place. That it is, in the language of one contemporary naturopathic profile, a specific for peptic ulcers both prophylactically and as treatment, a plant to take before the ulcer develops, if you know you are prone to them, a plant to take when the ulcer is present to protect the damaged tissue and support its recovery. Both directions, both timings. The dual action of regulating gastric acid and protecting the mucous membranes. These two functions working together is what makes meadowsweet unusual in the landscape of plants used for digestive complaints. Many plants are soothing, many plants are astringent. Fewer plants both regulate the production of the acid that is causing the problem and simultaneously protect the tissue the acid is damaging. This combination is the specific quality that makes it a specific in the herbalist's technical sense. Not just a useful plant for digestive complaints generally, but the plant you reach for first when the complaint is peptic ulceration or acid-driven gastric damage. The living folk tradition is not merely historical. Ethnomedicinal fieldwork conducted in North Karelia, Finland, in the 2010s, within the lifetime of many people reading or hearing this, records Filipendula ulmaria among the plants still in active use, not as a curiosity, not as something an elderly person remembers their grandmother using, as something people are actually still using in the present tense, in the way that living traditions are used, practically without drama, because it works and they know it works, and that knowledge has not been interrupted. A Finnish ethnomedicinal survey confirms that ethnic Finns and Karelians share broadly similar current uses for the plant. The knowledge crosses the ethnic and linguistic boundary between these two peoples while remaining consistent in its content, the same plant, the same applications, the same understanding of what it is for. This is what a living tradition looks like. Not a text, not a museum piece, not a reconstruction. People in the present century in northern Finland making tea from a plant that Harper Streng wrote about in the 13th century for broadly the same reasons. The chain is unbroken. 8 centuries of continuous use in the same geographic region, with the same plant for the same core complaints. That is not a coincidence or a cultural affectation. That is the persistence of knowledge that works. In Austria, both the flowers and the herb of meadowsweet are formally recognized as medicinal drugs today. Not in the folk sense alone, but in the pharmacopoeial sense. A contemporary Austrian herbal profile makes this explicit. These are considered medicinal drugs reflecting formal acceptance rather than purely traditional status. The plant has crossed the threshold from folk medicine into the official pharmacopoeia. It is on the formal list. And the same Austrian profile notes that different parts of the plant are used in cooking. This dual existence, medicinal drug and culinary ingredient, pharmacy shelf and kitchen, is not a modern development. It is the continuation of a pattern that runs through the entire history of meadowsweet, a plant that has always lived simultaneously in the apothecary's jar and the kitchen, the herbalist's prescription and the cook's recipe. The same scent that perfumed the mead at Bronze Age feasts and flavored the wines that Harper Streng prescribed for viper bites is present in modern culinary preparations of the plant's flowers, in syrups and vinegars and jellies and desserts that carry that sweet, almond-touched, slightly medicinal fragrance into contexts that are purely about pleasure. Medicine and food. The boundary between them with this plant has never been very firm. The pharmacognosy literature, the scientific study of plant-derived medicines, adds further layers to the picture. Reviews of the experimental evidence note antioxidant, antimicrobial, and gastroprotective actions in laboratory and animal studies, supporting the traditional use for inflammatory and digestive conditions. The antioxidant activity is what you would expect from a plant rich in flavonoids, a capacity to neutralize the reactive oxygen species that contribute to cellular damage and chronic inflammation. The antimicrobial activity is more specific, evidence that some of the plant's compounds are active against certain bacterial and fungal species, which may partly explain its traditional use for infections and its long history as a wound treatment. A wound treated with a plant that is both anti-inflammatory and antimicrobial has 2 of the most important properties. A wound treatment can have: the inflammation is managed, the infection risk is reduced, the tissue can heal without being overwhelmed by either the immune response or the microbial challenge. This is not sophisticated. It is exactly right. A 2024 pharmacological review, the most recent formal assessment of the plant's pharmaceutical potential, at the time of this telling, notes that Filipendula ulmaria is of active interest to the pharmaceutical industry for a specific list of conditions: rheumatism, arthrosis, arthritis, gastrointestinal disorders, liver malfunction, and gout. Rheumatism, arthritis, gout, gastrointestinal disorders. The same complaints that appear in the folk record of Northern Europe, the same complaints that appear in Harper Streng 13th century prescriptions, the same complaints that the EMA report lists as traditional indications. The pharmaceutical industry, in 2024, is interested in this plant for the same reasons that a Danish physician was interested in it 8 centuries earlier. The wheel has not so much turned, as it has come back to face the same direction.